What an amazing, amazing day one we had. And for those of you who missed it, we are so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Karen Carrington, and I am a talk show host, an author, a mental health advocate. I'm a philanthropist. And what I do is I have a talk show that features a men's series called A Man's Voice, where I provide a safe space for men to speak their truth. So, what a fitting symposium to be able to host. And I'm honored to be your host today. Today, the symposium 2020 North American MenEngage Symposium. This conversation is all about intersectionality and decolonization. So together we can build and propel the movement to engage men and boys for gender equality. Today, just like the other day, is all about transforming old paradigms, dismantling patriarchy. It's about deconstructing capitalism, disrupting the toxic masculinities in our systems and in our institutions. Today is a call to action for men joining forces and promoting gender equality. And these impactful discussions that we're all having really help us move forward. We together can make change. Decolonization and intersectionality is something, it's work that belongs to all of us. So the hashtag for today, we are going to hashtag Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I am because you are. I am because you are. It's traditional philosophy and African philosophy, really reflecting on how we were all connected in each other's humanity. It really describes a sense of unity between people, and it represents the togetherness and the connection. We're all human because of each other. We all need each other. We cannot grow in isolation. So with that being said, I'm so excited to have Greg Cloud with us. He's going to do the Indigenous opening ceremony. Greg is an educator, he's a singer, he's the co-founder of Wicha, which is a nonprofit Native Men Against Domestic and Sexual Abuse. It's located on the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and Greg and his team focus on educating young men, boys, develop healthy leadership skills and equal relationships. So I am so honored to pass this over to Greg. Greg, are you ready to do this?
Yes, ma'am.
If you're ready, we're ready. Our next segment, we have Unoma is going to be with us. Unoma Azuah, she teaches writing at the Illinois Institute of Art in Chicago. Oh, how I love Chicago. And her research and her activism really focuses on sexual minority rights in Nigeria. And what I love about Unoma is her book that launched called Embracing My Shadow. And do you know what? It is the first Nigerian lesbian memoir where she shares her challenging experiences as a lesbian in Nigeria and navigating abuse, discrimination, and homophobia in a hyper religious and patriarchal Nigerian society. I can't wait to have her join us. You guys are in for a treat. Unoma, are you there with me?
Yes, I am.
I can't wait to just hear so much more about you. Thank you for being here with us. I'm going to pass it over to you, and I'm going to get comfortable and just really hear what you have to say. We're all super excited.
Thank you so much, Karen, and it's wonderful to be here to share space with you. The title of my talk is As the World Wishes, Confronting Injustice with Truth. My grandmother gave me the name Unoma, which in the Igbo language of southeastern Nigeria means good home. I'm a child born in a good home. Her idea in naming me assumes that any person of wisdom will marry a woman born in a good home. So, to get me a wise husband, she named me appropriately. Well, I can't speak of a husband, but I do speak of bearing and sustaining a good home because I'm finally at home with who I am. I am a woman, Black, African, immigrant, lesbian, writer, and a believer in African spirituality. Even though there are days I wake up worried about which of these identities will make me lose my job, be insulted, or get outrightly killed, I do not take for granted the pleasure of self awareness and the liberty of self acceptance that I own. And writing has been one of the primary tools that help me achieve self acceptance and self awareness. Growing up, one of my aspirations was to live in a world where I could not feel the need to apologize for my existence. However, the first shock of my adulthood was discovering that such a world did not exist. So I decided to create the kind of world I hope to live in. Since the world worked so hard to erase me and my kind, I realized it was necessary to work harder and more defiantly to reassert our place in the human scheme. That we exist, I believe, is enough validation to pursue our dreams of happiness. I got introduced to religion as a patriarchy in Christianity. Otherwise, my early exposure to religion was through my grandmother, who introduced me to the river goddess of Asaba people, Onishe. She described Onishe as a large breasted mother. Her breasts, I presume, are symbolic of surplus. On my mother's path, though she eventually became spiritual, she was religious. She took me to conversion therapy to cure me of lesbianism. She wanted me to be normal. A pastor took me down to the river to break my bond with water spirits. I was said to have a connection with Onishe, who owns me, so I'm never destined to marry a man. Incidentally, in the dead of the night, when the pastor took me to the river and was casting out demons, but halfway through his prayers, he tore into a race. I was not sure about what was chasing him. I waddled out of the river, shivering from the cold, and traced my way home. There were some fishermen who saw me walking through the river path. They abandoned their fishing nets and ran away from me. The fishermen abandoning their nets to run is emblematic of the demonization of the queer body. It also reveals a human reaction to the unordinary. My mother's eyes opened when I escaped being raped by the pastor. She became so remorseful for putting me in danger. But by then, the condemnation of the Christian world had already left wounds and scares of shame in my psyche. I felt unworthy of salvation and grace. I constantly diminished myself to accommodate what I was supposed to be. But my experience of healing has taught me to aspire beyond the confessional. I believe I have nothing to confess, nothing to be ashamed of. So I no longer negotiate with a world that sought ways to destroy me. I only live. That is all I owe myself and those who believe in the possibility of my continued existence. My greatest responsibility, I think, is to rouse myself and people like me to our greatest oracular height, that point where our words become prophecies of transformation and protests against injustice. The search for authenticity is laborious and often solitary an experience. Occasions like this, which brings together a community of humans united by their shared desire for truth, lessens the burden of uncertainty associated with self discovery and confers on our quest a strong legitimacy and engenders in us a firm confidence in our rights as human beings. I intend to continue the search by sharing with you some of my personal experiences with a touch of history, which I think may resemble yours in a way, with the hope that our mutual efforts, seen and heard, will find an enduring expression today and beyond. Here in America, especially Christians, have often told me to be quiet about my belief in African spirituality. Frankly, I find their nerve amusing. I encourage their nerve, I feel, is a courage that derives from arrogant ignorance that can only pollute the world with intolerance and hate. The refusal of these kind of people to admit that Christianity met a people with a solid and sustaining religion in Africa speaks both to the hypocrisy of the Christian agency and to the hegemony of a colonial mission. It is the Abrahamic religions that expunge and continue to obliterate the positive concept Africa has of its culture, including its range of sexualities. Macau Mutua captures this damage when he states, and I quote, Africa from top to bottom was remade in the image of Europe, complete with Eurocentric modern states. Christianity played a crucial role in this process, winning Africans from their roots and pacifying them for the new order, practically killing local religious traditions and then closed off society from other persuasions. Islam, which had invaded Africa at an earlier date, was equally insidious and destructive of local religions. Its forceful conversions and wars of conquest, together with its prohibition of its repudiation, were violative of the rights of Africans as well. Progress, culture, and humanity were identified entirely in Islamic or Christian terms, never with reference to indigenous traditions. End of quote. Pre-Islamic northern Nigeria, for instance, had and still has non-gender binary relationships and practices. As the sociologist Rudy Gario shares, in the state of Kano in northern Nigeria, there are a group of men called Yandaudu who have sex with men. Some of these men are effeminate and do not follow strict gender norms and attitudes. They wear women's clothing and even use female pronouns when addressing themselves. They keep male lovers and take on traditionally feminine tasks, such as cooking and selling food. Often they enjoy lavish gifts from both their lovers and their male admirers. They live openly and are very visible in their communities. Then, in the Igbo culture, marriages between women existed, just as in the Nuer ethnic group of Sudan, where a woman who has no child can marry a woman to bear children for her, and the father of the children will have no rights over the children and over their mother. Historically, marriage was not necessarily seen as a heteronormative sacrament in several parts of Africa. As Esen Nyek notes, gender fluidity outside of heterosexual marriage was evident in Africa. Among the Bulai and Hige in northern Nigeria, a woman maintains several marriages simultaneously. Each of these marriages are legal. These social practices and sexual expressions did not survive colonial onslaught. However, the Igbo culture in which my grandmother brought me up is accommodating of other cultures and people because diversity is a force of life. Who better affirm this than Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Prize Peace Laureate? Because, as she says, and I quote, for all human beings, wherever we were born or grew up, the environment fostered our values, nurtured our bodies, and developed our religions. It defined who we are and how we see ourselves. No one culture is applicable to all human beings. None can satisfy all communities. Just as we are finally starting to see the value of biological diversity, we are also belatedly recognizing that humanity needs to find beauty in its diversity of cultures and accept that there are many languages, religions, attires, dances, songs, symbols, festivals, and traditions, and that these cultural diversity should be seen as a natural heritage of humankind, end of quote. Therefore, in my difference, in my Igbo traditional system, it offers me the freedom of self-expression and recognizes my right to be. While I do not consider my belief perfect, I am glad that it accepts a curious mind like mine, and it creates space for the kind of criticism and inquiries my mind is capable of. I am thus suspicious of any institution that thrives on silencing and dehumanizing others for their individualities. Conversely, colonialism was about dehumanization. It was about dominating and devaluing colonized subjects. One of such debasing acts that comes to mind is the dehumanization of Sarah Batman of South Africa. Natasha Gordon Chimpembera explores the relevance of this idea to contemporary times when she observes that Sarah Batman's legacy says a lot about the present depictions and construction of African women in the 21st century. It is also important to note how the shifts in the historical presentations of colonial writing show the image of God within the Eurocentric ahistorical accounts of Batman. It is within these accounts that the tacit, racist, and sexist expansion of European language is utilized, not exclusively with Batman, but also with the bodies of Black women, especially with its fixation and mostly the anomaly of their hypersexual genitals. Breton and Maynard further describe this phenomenon when they say that, and I quote, domination always involves the objectification of the dominated. All forms of oppression imply the devaluation of the subjectivity of the oppressed. Nevertheless, self-evaluation and self-affirmation are two ways of resisting oppression, end of quote. They maintain that the practice of self-awareness helps preserve the self-esteem of the group that is being oppressed, while allowing them to avoid any dehumanizing outside forces. That is why the hypocrisy and double standards in the way African religions are seen through the colonial lens is unjust. An African traditional religious rite that involves a trance dance where a prophetess or prophet prophesies through an ancestral spirit possession is seen as evil. But the speaking in tongues, Holy Spirit possessed prophet or prophetess in a Christian church is seen as righteous, and the act of that prophecy is seen as the holy act of God. My first real experience of religious domination was in high school. One of the Reverend sisters was talking about God being protective of us. I remember my grandmother telling me the same about her Asaba goddess, Onishe. The Reverend sister told me that Onishe is not a god, but an idol as good as a piece of wood. I was upset at her. I knew she was wrong, and I told her as much. I was convinced that my grandmother's faith in Onishe will not be reduced to a piece of wood. From that point on, I started questioning my faith as a Christian and got to the resolution, as my grandmother explained, that there are many gods, and Onishe is one of them. The God of Christians is also one of them. So my interest in the history of my people is rooted both in the need to excavate these cultural and religious elements that represent our lives before colonialism and in the desire to authenticate my identities through my primordial heritage. I share in Chinua Achebe's vision of Africa when he says, and I quote, I will be quite satisfied if my novels, especially the ones set in the past, did no more than teach my readers that their past, with all its imperfections, was not the long night of savagery from which the first Europeans, acting on God's behalf, delivered them. End of quote. Achebe articulates my thoughts precisely. So I'm grateful to my grandmother who, through the confident life she led, offered me the courage to live my own life in the best way that I know too. Being a Black immigrant comes with the burden of being seen as a victim of poverty, somebody in search of heaven, which only America or the Western world provides. So Americans, especially white Americans, expect you to be ever grateful, even when they drop both subtle and blatant insults on your path. Your accent is a sign of inferiority, except, of course, if you're French or Eastern European. They help you complete your sentences. They ask unwitting questions based on their ignorance about the world and particularly Africa. They ask about famine, about wars, about hunger, and about if lions roam free in your woods. Sometimes your qualifications do not matter because your status has placed you at the very rump of the Western society. Being a Black immigrant is twice as hard. I remember one of the many incidents of racism I experienced. I was a graduate student in Cleveland, Ohio. I then was staying with my guardians who lived in a white neighborhood. When I got to the train station, from school, I'll take the train where I usually leave my bicycle. When I got to the train station and as I unchained my bicycle, I saw a couple of white women look at me. They seemed lost, but they smiled at me, so I waved at them. Then I mounted my bicycle and headed home. Within minutes, I heard a siren blaring behind me. Then a police officer stopped right next to me and yelled at me to stop. I stopped, curious about why he stopped me. He started with asking me for the receipt of my bicycle. I was shocked. For a moment, the Nigerian police flashed across my mind. I mean, who carries receipt for a bicycle purchase around? I told him I didn't have it with me, but if he could follow me home, I would provide it. He scoffed and asked if I lived in the neighborhood. I said yes. He laughed. This time I got agitated. I asked him if he was looking for a stolen bicycle. He ignored me and asked for my ID. I gave him my student ID and insisted that he should answer my question. He then told me that a couple of women called to report that a Black woman was stealing a bicycle at the train station. I was the wrong body encroaching on the right white space. But I am a writer. What this means is that I'm a person who traverses the tangible and the intangible places of reality and illusion, of myth and ritual. My writing is a product of a constant desire to dialogue with myself, a documentation of my efforts to access the truth of my African culture, and a manifestation of my attempt to use that heritage as a tool for self appraisal. I got introduced to words and stories at my grandmother's feet. The story she told me opened my eyes to the imaginary world, to the power of words and the freedom in flying free across the open fields of my mind. Then, Buchi Emecheta and Florent Wapa, to give examples of some Nigerian writers that affected me greatly. Emecheta and Wapa ushered me into the power of women, while male Nigerian writers only showed me how women can be confined to specific roles. Wapa and Emecheta showed me otherwise, and through their writing, they empowered me. They made me believe that my ability should not be restricted by my gender. Emecheta's joys of motherhood made a great impact on me because of how she navigates irony in societal expectations of women's roles. The book speaks to how everything is not always what it's cut out to be. We can't all toe the same lines, even when such roles are seen as a standard. And this reminds me of how complex life is, where it becomes about perspective, who is looking and where are they looking from. This again reminds me of a saying, and I quote, what the spider sees as life is actually death for the fly, end of quote. So the novel gave me the permission to choose freedom, the audacity to be unburdened by social cultural expectations that do not acknowledge my individual strivings and desires. When I first read the book, I was drawn to honor. Many years have passed since then, yet fondness for the book continues to deepen with each rereading. Honor's strength of character and youthfulness enabled her to reject the various oppressions African women are subjected to. Although her decision to remain Nwokocha Abadi's mistress, in spite of the lure of marriage, is considered arrogant for an Ibuzo woman, she holds tenaciously onto it till the end. Honor thus becomes a standard bearer of the ideals of an African woman like me who is open to options that are not necessarily the norm. Also, in Florent Wapa's debut novel, Efuru, Efuru's independence constitutes an enabling ground for the freedom of all women, demonstrating the link between independence and progress. The novel emphasizes the possibility of the emancipation of African women from the religious and cultural barriers that sustain patriarchy. While allowing me to speak to my pain and create empowerment out of it, it proves to me that it is possible to disrupt my oppressor's tools and use them to my advantage. It shows me that I can name what has been used to shame me, and claim it, because speaking to that which is meant to be hidden makes it come to light, makes it emerge, makes it be. I am. I emerged through wreckages. I have battled basically all my life to avoid being erased as a lesbian, African, Black, woman, immigrant in spaces where I am never supposed to exist. And Audre Lorde echoes this feeling for me, and I quote, once I accepted my position as different from the larger society, as well as from my single sub society, Black, gay, I didn't have or try so hard to be accepted, to look firm, to look straight, to look proper, to look nice, to be liked, to be loved, to be approved. What I didn't realize was how much harder I had to try merely to stay alive, or rather to stay human, how much stronger a person I became in the trying. End of quote. I think of Chinelo Oparenta's Under the Udala Tree, and I marvel at the distinctive power of literature to vividly reflect life. My reality is that I'm a lesbian born in Nigeria during the Biafra War, so my experience and that of Ijoma, the protagonist of the novel, converge in a most evocative manner. Our fathers were victims of war. They died in our childhood. They grew up, we grew up liking girls. Our attraction to girls was a source of worry for our mothers, who, through the Christian agency, attempted to free our body and soul from the sin of homosexuality. I remember my mother always chasing after me when I played soccer with the boys. She was terrified of my gender non-conforming nature. She was worried for me, for the world I was going to encounter. But her hostility towards my gender non-conforming disposition made me more determined to be myself. When she insisted that I act and be a girl who is obedient and open to learn the act of becoming a wife and a mother, I thought the act of running a home as a mother and a wife was more like a burden than a joy. In a manner similar to mine, Ijeoma's mother strives to separate her from the places and people she genuinely loves by bringing her daughter back from Onewi, where she lived with family friends, to Ojoto. Adora demonstrates a grave misconception of the idea of home. Home for Ijoma, home for me, is where the heart finds love. Ijeoma's marriage, her divorce, her eventual acceptance of her true self are definitive representations of my life. Moreover, our awareness of the purity of our form and our brazen embrace of that form are our protest against an unfortunate homophobic world. So I document my life. I write for posterity. I wrote my memoir, Embracing My Shadow, for instance, for girls like me who have no voice, who accept being oppressed and diminished and silenced as part of the normal. I wrote to let them know that they're not alone, that there is nothing wrong with being different, being queer, not accepting to the status quo because they don't have to. All they owe themselves is to be just as they are, beautiful, complete. I also wrote my memoir to testify to triumph, even with all the setbacks and forces that insisted that I'm not worthy to be. I am and will remain. I say the same to queer people, not just in Nigeria, but to queer people all over the world. We are and will remain. There is a saying among the Igbo that the hen which screams when a hawk abducts her chick does not do so with intention that the captor will free her child, but that rather she only wants the world to hear her voice and bear witness to her condition. I've chosen to end this lecture with this proverb because it captures what marginalized and oppressed people all over the world have been conditioned rather to believe for many years. I have heard people wonder which God of justice a diviner calls upon in a situation where the hawk and the hen are suppliants at the same shrine. But I do not think that our idea of justice should get this callous. I do not think it is right to philosophize justice to the point that we are willing to excuse injustice. The hen and her children are victims of the hawk's repeated assault. We shall never be too proud or too ashamed to say this truth. The refusal of the world to listen to the hen and stop the hawk from executing evil against her family consolidates my perception of the usefulness of this proverb in a time like this. It is important that we confront injustice with truth and protest. The change we hope to inspire is one that will remain long after we are gone. It will ensure that we are not forgotten as the world wishes. Thank you so much for listening. And there are three video clips that I would like to share with you. One of them is of a Nigerian cross-dresser called Area Scatter, who shares his gift of performance in a traditional setting. He's actually invited to the local chief's palace to perform. The second video is of Sarah Batman and of course her dehumanization. And then the last one is of traditional religious rites that involves trance dance. And I'm sharing that because I want us to look at the parallel between the trance dance, the prophecies that traditional prophets give, and compare that to the same rites and rituals that occur in a Christian church. Once again, thank you.
Wow, that was extremely powerful, Unoma. There were so many layers to your talk and the videos and your experiences and your challenges. There's so much to unpack there. There's so much to unpack there, especially the part when you were saying, really covering intersectionality, um, being Black, being an immigrant, being a lesbian, being a woman. There's so many things there crossing over. And it was really powerful when you said, I don't know which one I may get killed for today.
Yeah.
And especially that video with Sarah Barton.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much going on in the world lately. And I think some of us are becoming desensitized. And when I watched that video, I cried. I cried. Sometimes I'm seeing things lately and I try not to bring it inside, but that video, I cried. And there was a lot of layers there too as well. I have a question for you. With all of that being said, everything you just presented to us, do you really think we could tackle decolonization? Do you think there will ever be an end to it?
Let me start by quoting Franz Fanon. I think it's in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, where he said that decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. But the decolonization that I think we should focus on is actually the decolonizing the mind. Um,
Mm.
yes, because I mean, where do we start from? How do we start on learning centuries of brainwashing, of oppression, of being told that you're inferior? But the awareness that it exists and recognizing the oppressive nature helps us know how to battle it and how to address it. And some may say, well, do we go entirely indigenous? Well, we may not be able to go 100% indigenous, but we can actually start from somewhere. You
Mhm.
know, start by rewriting the wrong histories, start by recreating whatever was erased of our history. And simple things, building up our languages, encouraging its spread or its learning, stopping educational policies that still oppress us. I remember that in primary school, my teacher used to punish me a lot for speaking what she called vernacular. You're not supposed to speak the native language, you're supposed to speak English, and then the textbooks that I read, I struggled for a while to identify sections, characters, and landscapes that I could that resonates with me. I learned about America and about snow
Mm.
way too early, and it was a struggle because well, what happens to my trees that I know behind my grandmother's house? Why are these not in books? Why do I have to read about snow and Santa and all that? So all that we actually need to start re do I say relearning or learning to recognize that no, that is not really the dominant story. There are other stories that we need to know. And that speaks again to diversity. Let all be present, let all be represented. None should be diminished because we're all the same and equal from any lens or from any perspective.
Yeah, you're right. You're talking about your teenage years. And I remember reading your book. And there was this part where you were with your friend Nilo. Oh, how I love that character, Nilo. And you had such a strong relationship with her, and you did anything just to get to her house to see her.
Yeah.
And there was this part where I just loved that you were friends and it was so innocent. And I love the relationship between you two. And then there was a part, if I may ask, where there was an intimacy between you two. And then her father walked in and he had a flashlight while the two of you were intimate. And I remember in that part reading that myself, bringing myself back to my teenage years where I would be caught doing bad things. And so when I was reading it, I'm like, oh God, no, 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 no. When the dad was coming in the room, I went, no, I was so scared for you. I was so scared for you. And then I put myself in your shoes, remembering how I was as a teen, almost getting caught with a boy. And then I put myself in your shoes, or tried to, being caught with another girl. So now I'm afraid of my father catching us. And then it's something different, another layer to that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I just wanted to ask you about that. Was there fear of being caught, period, or because it was with another female?
Both. It was both, which makes it even more frightening, um, because the psyche, the feeling of being caught becomes what one has to live with. Because I mean, in a society like Nigeria, in a homophobic society like Nigeria, you're not supposed to be odd or queer. So you're constantly checking yourself. Well, have I done something that I may be caught? Or what would I do this time that may put me in the light of, oh, you've done something wrong? So, yes, because the father, of course, like most parents in Nigeria, are religious. So it's bad enough that we're girls. Then to indulge in intimacy, oh no. I mean, I've been thrown
Right?
out
I
of
was like,
the house.
oh no.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thrown out of the house. Maybe we would have been forgiven if I were a boy and she's a girl, you
I
know?
I think it would have been more easily forgiven.
Yes, yes. So that's one of the traumas, I mean, where people have to deal with, navigating a society that is basically heteronormative. So, yeah.
Yeah, I get that. And then there's so many, like oppression has it's a matrix. It's really convoluted. Lots of layers to that. How do you navigate through that?
It's a lot, I must confess. It's a lot to deal with. And when I think about intersectionality and where I fall in, which would include my height, besides my age sometimes, and of course class, I I think of the days I struggle with it because, for instance, as a child, I remember that I had to live with my relatives who had, I think they came back from somewhere in Europe, and I had come from the village where I was staying with my grandmother. And I started observing that there were certain privileges I didn't have because of the fact that I came from a village, and there were privileges they had because they had lived abroad. So the issue for me as a child wasn't necessarily about being deprived or denied, but I was upset in a particular incident where we had to eat a meal. I think it was yam, and yam was eaten with tomato sauce. We call it stew in Nigeria, and it wasn't enough. It didn't go around, So because I'm from the village, I knew how to eat with palm oil, you
Mm.
know, which is okay. But being that young and that sensitive, I was upset because I was denied, the piece of meat I should have had. So that gave me my early exposure to, class, where do you belong, what do you deserve, and what don't you deserve. So all those experiences, of course, came with their own types of trauma, but recognizing them, in all that I carry, which is basically a burden. Being Black, being a woman, being a lesbian, to me is a burden, especially in the society that we live in. So I say that recognizing it helps me a lot because it helps me decide, well, think, this, you know what it is. How would you react to it? So in situations where, for instance, I am found, in the case of racial profiling, I know not to act in a certain way. I know to
Mm.
listen, be obedient. Yes, sir.
Mm.
Thank you, sir. Just to think about my safety. Because while somebody of another race could get away with it, I may not. So
Mm.
all that to say that being aware of these helps. And if there are moments to educate, that also helps. Where somebody will say, for instance, well, you're from Africa. Do you have lions in your backyard? Or I'll say, no, I don't. And
So
this
they
is
still, someone still
greater.
says that now. They still.
Yeah, I remember, yes, somebody does that when I was in graduate school.
Girl, you should
I
just say
got so
yes.
many
Just say
questions.
yes. Just say yes.
So I try to use that opportunity to educate. So it's just too much. How much of this matrix can you actually unravel? How much of it can you decide to share without necessarily getting emotional and angry about it? So
Mm.
you learn so many acts just to survive. And to me,
Mm.
it's only a superhuman that can do that because there's so much going on in your
On your
head
head.
in a
And who do
specific
I be
times.
today? Do I be Black today? Do I be a woman today? Do I be a
Ex-
lesbian today? Do I be all three? Right?
exactly.
And
Imagine dealing with that on a
yes, on
constant
a
basis.
constant. And then we talked about the other day on day one, you add perhaps a disability on top of that,
Oh,
right? Oh,
yeah.
right. And do you ever find that being one of the three is harder than the other? You know where I'm going with that?
Yes, yes. Well, the thing to me is that because it all levels out at the point of oppression and injustice, right?
Hmm.
None of that is right. Like identifying me, singling me out as a black, singling me out as a woman, they're all connected. So even if at the end of the day, you get away with the fact that you're male and I'm female, you may be gotten at the fact that you're black and I'm black. So that is why
Right.
it's important to emphasize intersectionality and let us recognize it and let us fight the injustice of social structures. Because, like the philosophy of Ubuntu, if I am affected, you
I'm
will be affected.
affected. Right.
Yeah,
I am as
yeah,
you are.
exactly. So while some may be more emphasized or maybe may have more implications, deadly implications, it's important that we look at it for what it is, the problem that it is, and recognize that it has to be tackled. Injustice is
Mhm.
unfair. And if it doesn't affect you, you think that it doesn't affect you, think again
It
because
does.
somewhere down the line, it will
It will.
affect you.
It will.
Yes, yes.
It
So affect
will.
somebody that you know, that you care about. And in that way, it does affect you.
Right. And like we said with Ubuntu, with everyone as we know is the hashtag for today, we're all connected in some in some way.
No.
And my last question for you is, did you ever think it was better at any point on your journey to hide that you are a lesbian? Was it safer to hide it, or being an activist, or activists known or expected to always speak out? You're an activist, you need to speak out. Or was there a time when you made that decision that this time I'm going to keep it quiet?
Oh, yeah. There have been several occasions. It's a survival tool, So in Nigeria, for example, there are situations where I have to act straight, pretend, oh, this is my boyfriend. And, you know, so
And he goes
yeah.
along with it, right? He doesn't blow
Oh,
your
yeah.
cover, right? But yeah, he doesn't blow your cover, right? Because
Maybe give him some money
I
or
was about to say,
something,
do what you need to do, right? Or you're both getting killed, right?
Yes. So it's been a process. So I've evolved. I've moved from a point of, okay, there's something wrong with me. Okay, I'll obediently go for your conversion therapy. To, oh no, I have a boyfriend. To, oh yes, yes, I'm waiting for a husband. To the point where I said, hell no, I'm none of this. And I'm tired of lying. It's
My name is
exhausting.
Anumo. I'm black. I'm a woman. I'm a lesbian.
Lesbian,
Get
I'm
my
all of
book.
it. so, so yeah, that's it.
Oh, I love this. I love this conversation. I absolutely love you. I love everything that you brought to the table today. So much awareness, so much layers. And I know there's so much more work to do, but the foundation that you've set for all of us today really, really opened our eyes and awareness. And I absolutely love everything that you taught. Shin wanted to know, what advice would you give a person who wants to use decolonization as an approach or strategy?
A
So
strategy of survival, or
let me see the full, and Shane, thank you for that amazing question. Let me just get the whole thing. Strategy when engaging people, like in general. Yeah.
yeah, I think is depending on the perspective you're coming from. It's good to accept yourself in whatever spiritual cultural, societal values that you hold. And I think it's always best to dialogue, to converse, because there are people who may not be aware or may want to hold on to the power that the privileges they have confer on them. So you get to the point of negotiating, to talk about it, to reassert the fact that we all are not and will never be the same. So decolonizing is actually recognizing our authentic selves and claiming it and projecting it and educating people who may not know that, look, this is not the only thing, there are others. And to look at all of this from a perspective that lets you appreciate each difference with the value that come with.
That's very well said. Well said. That's a
Thank you.
great strategy that we could all take from. I
Thank you.
absolutely love spending this day with you, all the time that we've had over the last couple of weeks and all of the, I can't wait to get to the end of that book. My second time reading it. I'm going to go back to it tonight. I absolutely love you. We love you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I really appreciate sharing this space with you all.
We appreciate you. And I'm going to come see you in Chicago soon.
You better do.
I will, with the
I'll be
no
waiting.
snow. Love you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Wasn't that, woo, just, what's the word for that? Ubuntu. I think that's a hashtag moment for sure. For sure. So that was really, really just enlightening. Thank you for all these comments. And Marisha is saying, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. That is so beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you for that, Marisha. And all the, thank you, Carlos, for the hashtag. Let me see here. So we're going to bring up Russ Funk, one of my favorite people ever. Russ, do we have you here?
I'm here.
Woohoo! Look at you. Look at you. Oh, I'm so super excited for this portion. And for those, yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Russ is just an amazing person all around, does so much important work when it comes to engaging men and boys. And he is the program consultant for NAMEN. And today what he's going to be doing is providing an overview of the state of the field report. So we're going to speak with Russ for a bit. He's going to give us a bit of information, and then we're going to go and dive right into the roundtable. So Russ, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you all for joining us. I hope that you are able to see my screen at this point. I'm going to do a quick overview of the state of the field report that NAMEN is in the process of finalizing. And then we'll bounce it to Aptigard for the actual discussion of the roundtable. And my screen is, oh, for crying out loud. And my screen just locked up. There we go. Okay. So just a brief overview about NAMEN. We are a network, that is made up of both individual and organizational members representing both Canada and the United States. Our major funding sources are from dues and donations, and our funding from the Global MenEngage Alliance. Our main service areas are policy advocacy, our biweekly newsletter, and an early childhood initiative effort. And I want to just take a moment to talk about our newsletter, because I think that effort highlights the difference between us as a network and other kinds of national or binational organizations. If you think about most communications you get from an organization, some of the big ones that you may be familiar to in terms of this type of men's work, what you tend to find in terms of content is information about them and the organization and the services they provide. Those of you who are members know that our newsletter, which comes out every other week, focuses on news from the field. And so we will not just update you about what NAMEN is up to, but we'll also update you about information and resources from White Ribbon Campaign, or Next Gen Men, or Call to Men, or Coaching Boys into Men. And so you get a much more vast array of services and resources from around the country, around the world, and the efforts and services and resources that are becoming available. And I just want to make a point at that, to make a pitch, as those of you in the U.S. know, yesterday, was Giving Tuesday. And as I mentioned above, a significant portion of our dues come from donations and membership dues. I'm going to make an ask right now for you to encourage you to consider making a donation to NAMEN to support our work and our efforts. Due to some funding from the Global MenEngage Secretariat, we were able to put the symposium on for you all. And continuing the work is going to continue to require some additional funding, so please consider giving. NAMEN is a member of the Global MenEngage Alliance. The Global MenEngage Alliance is a network of networks of these kinds of efforts throughout the world. So for today's agenda, I'm going to provide a brief, like 10 or 15-minute overview of our State of the Field report. I'll then turn it over to Aptagarg, who will moderate the panel discussion. And then they'll dive in. There's going to be 5 panelists who will dive into the conversation itself. You are encouraged to participate. This State of the Field report is the first of its kind in the US and Canada to look at kind of the scope of the field and what's happening around Canada and the US in terms of engaging in efforts. The report is not done, however. NAMEN considers this to be an ever-growing, emergent work in progress. So while we have completed the formal kind of report in a draft form, the conversation today is information that we hope to gather to inform the report. I am going to actually step aside during the panel and look at the chat and participate and use this opportunity to collect more data from you all about your experiences and your expertise to continue to inform the report itself. And even after this report is published, which we're aiming for early 2021, we're going to continue to use this as a point of departure to continue this conversation around where are we as a state of this work in this region. So the State of the Field report, our methodology was what was called a desk review, which basically means I get to sit at my desk and reach out and find out what's happening around the country and around the region in terms of engagement efforts. Funding did not allow for a much deeper or more rigorous methodology. What that meant was primarily a scan of what's the information that was available online. And if you're familiar with research methodology, it was kind of a snowball effect. So I would talk with somebody or learn about an organization through the network and then or through the website, and then reach out to who they knew who was also doing this work. I would then also follow this up with key interviews with some of the key contacts from those organizations when I could reach them, and then looked at the relevant practice literature. Canada is in a very different place in this work than the US, and so they actually have several countrywide reports relative to engaging in work that aren't available here in the US as yet. So that was an additional source of data for the report. One of the things that we found is that male engagement, in quote, is not universally defined. We do not have a clear idea of what it means for, if you will, for what does it mean for a man to be engaged? There is no clear definition of what that means. And the activities for male engagement more or less circle around these 5 methodologies. Educating men, developing a curricula, perhaps it's 3 weeks, perhaps it's 12, to provide to men about the issues of gender-based violence and men's role in preventing gender-based violence. Participation methodologies, which encourage men to participate in a Take Back the Night event or a Walk a Mile in Her Shoes event. Mobilizing men to take action on their own or to organize or to work collectively with other men to perhaps do a fundraising event or coach younger boys about healthy manhood or gender respect. Organizing methodologies, which focus primarily on leadership development and really honing in on what ways that men can work together and collectively to take action and change social norms or policy advocacy, and working through social media and social messaging to impact on gender-based violence and promoting gender equality. Most of the efforts that we found in our scan tend to focus on one population of men only. That is, there aren't a lot of multi-generational efforts in the US or Canada, more so in Canada, but certainly not so much in the US. The major focus across both countries is on adolescent and young adult men, thinking college age. There's very little work with the kind of the tween age men and boys, and almost no work in the US with younger boys. I found 2 programs throughout in our scan in Canada and the United States that worked on elementary age children in terms of the work of engaging men. There was also very little on the adult side. After college, there's very little effort in terms of engaging men and boys at those ages, although more so than the younger ages. There are an amazing amount of innovative efforts that are going on. Very creative, very innovative programming that you'll hear about in a minute in the roundtable, hopefully, that organizations are using, particularly more grassroots, community-based organizations are using to engage and mobilize men in this work. But one of the things that came strikingly clear is that there are few opportunities for peer networking in either the US or Canada, and certainly across the borders of the US-Canadian border, about what it means to be engaged and how to do this work, and what are the lessons that folks are learning about engaging men and engaging men effectively. There are no, in this region, we do not have any current standardized operating standards or principles, which means pretty much anybody can say they're doing engaging men work, and it could mean anything. Allied with or not with feminism, allied with or not other kinds of gender justice issues. There's nothing to guide us in terms of what's happening in this work. And there are true silos that have emerged in the way we are doing engaging men work. Some of those silos are in terms of distinguishing between preventing, responding, and intervening. As some of you know who are more on the programmatic side, there is significant funding challenge focused on engaging men to prevent gender-based violence. There are efforts to provide funding and support for men who have experienced domestic or sexual violence, either being victimized or being exposed to violence in some way. And there's funding streams and programs that work with men who perpetrated violence or sexism. And one of the things that I heard very commonly, particularly amongst community-based efforts and more activist-oriented efforts and practitioners, is that the men that we're trying to engage are actually all and. There are very few men who actually live in a space of either a preventionist or a victim survivor or a person who has perpetrated violence in the past. Most of us as human beings who live in male bodies are all three of the above, and yet our programming is very siloed between those distinctions. We also silo gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health, and responsible fatherhood work in three distinct areas, particularly in the United States, although to some degree it appears in both countries. There is very little interplay between engaging men in work, for example, in responsible fatherhood programs that also addresses engaging men as gender-based violence preventionists. There's some silos in terms of what we address. There are some programs that focus on engaging men in preventing sexual assault that don't address domestic and dating violence. There are programs that work on engaging men in sexual exploitation, but not also addressing domestic and dating violence. And we have silos, again, to a large degree because of the funding streams that around engaging men in communities or engaging men on campuses. I know of a number of communities that we found as an example is that there are efforts to engage men at the community level and effort to engage men in campuses within those communities, and they're not aware of each other. Some of the trends that we found in terms of the scan, that there is a heavy focus around both regions on prevention of gender-based violence. And what I mean by that is both, there isn't as much attention to engaging men in responding to and supporting victim survivors of gender-based violence or in supporting men who have perpetrated violence to be accountable. And also, there is not as much effort in either region in terms of engaging men in the promotion of gender equality or gender justice or whatever the pro-social language we want to use, which tends to run counter to what is emerging around engaging human beings in general, in that in the public health world, what we're learning is that people are more engageable in terms of what we're promoting versus what we're prevention. We are also learning this in justice work more broadly, that if you think about the racial justice work, the efforts to engage white folks is mobilizing white folks to promote racial justice, not to prevent racial violence. And I think that that promotional lens might have some opportunities to engage men in ways that focusing on prevention doesn't. There's a heavy reliance on bystander intervention in theory and practice in terms of the efforts to engage men and boys in both countries. And while there's some value to that, there's also some limitations to the bystander approach that aren't given a lot of breathing space. There are limited practices, particularly in the US, of engaging men and boys to challenge systemic or structural violence or the systemic or structural inequalities. The vast majority of work is focusing on individual level, perhaps relational level intervention and change. There is a major focus in both countries on engaging athletes at the high school and college level and fraternities at the college level. we found that there are right now 4 major national organizations in the US, as an example, who focus on engaging athletes, engaging coaches, engaging sports teams. And a question emerges in this work that in most high schools and colleges, athletes and fraternities are already the privileged few. If you look at high school campuses or college campuses, athletes and fraternities tend to have a exaggerated position in terms of social norms promotion, in terms of formal leadership roles on those campuses. And a question emerges, if we are focusing on our work on engaging the people who are already privileged, what does that mean about our work? And perhaps highlighting people who are underprivileged or marginalized in our efforts to engage men and boys. There isn't a lot of support for engaging in efforts to engage in meaningful evaluation of what they're doing. There is some support funding-wise and structurally wise and capacity building-wise in terms of the desire to do evaluation, and that certainly is true from the practitioners that we heard from. They want to be able to meaningfully evaluate what they're doing. But the funding sources, by and large, don't actually pay for doing meaningful evaluation or pay for the training to do meaningful evaluation or provide funding to pay for the resources and the tools that one needs to be able to engage in meaningful evaluation. We are very inconsistent in this region about meaningfully integrating an intersectional approach to our efforts to engage men and boys. There is a heavy reliance in our work, particularly those efforts that focus on a program type approach to engaging men and boys, on evidence-based and peer-reviewed type efforts. And one of the things that emerged from our conversation is that there's a valuing of the peer review model, but there's a recognition that when we talk about the peer review model, those people who are the peers of those spaces, primarily academic journals, are not our peers. They are largely not male engagement practitioners. They are largely not interracial or have an intersectional approach. It's a very limited scope. And there's a desire that came out of this conversation that isn't fitting to the theme of this symposium of how do we democratize and decolonize the peer review model. Practitioners seem very hungry to have an opportunity for their real peers to review and give feedback on the work that they're doing on the ground. The folks in Rhode Island want to hear from the folks in Texas or Washington State about what they're doing and how is it meaningful. The folks in Edmonton want to hear from the folks in Florida and have that meaningful peer review of what they're doing, but a meaningful peer review. And our scan also revealed that we are very uneven in this region around what accountable practice means. How do we work to engage men and boys in a way that's accountable to feminists, that's accountable to human rights work, that's accountable to intersectionality? We're kind of all over the place in terms of that and what that means. That's a very brief snapshot of the State of the Field report. Those are some of the highlights that we identified. I'm going to turn it over to APTA. I want to say again that the point of this is not to provide you a deep overview of the report. It's more to give an opportunity for the conversation to occur around the report and around what our panelists think of as the state of the field in this region and what you think is the state of the field of this region. Hopefully, the overview I gave you will give you some thoughts and engage some responses for you. I'm going to be moving to monitoring the chat, and paying attention in that way. And I'm very, very excited to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Apta Garg. Apta is the Senior Program Officer with Promundo. She focuses on Latin American and Caribbean efforts and is a technical co-coordinator for the Men Care campaign, She's also on the board of NAMEN and co-chair of the NAMEN Program Committee. And just personally, Apta has a wonderful sense of humor, a lot of energy, and she's just freaking brilliant. So I'm very happy to turn this over to Apta and let her have the conversation.
Thank you for that introduction, Russ. That was incredibly sweet and made me a little teary-eyed. Thank you, everyone, for your participation and for your enthusiastic participation It's been 2 really long days, but you guys have been here with us, and I really just want to acknowledge kind of this is a community, this is a movement, and really thank you and for honoring us with your time. I also want to thank Russ for that incredible presentation and for all the work he's done in this movement, in this field, and also for presenting that really valuable information to us, and to NAMEN and the Global Secretariat for all their support in giving us this platform in order to be able to share this with you. And also I want to just kind of quickly shout out Karen for her amazing facilitation moderation of these 2 days. It's been fantastic, and she's been incredible, and I really am thankful for everyone who helped to put this together. I want to now introduce our amazing panelists. They are incredible. We have had some discussions already, and I'm just so excited to be able to open up this conversation to you all. I would like to first present Amanda Capitonino. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She's a communications and evaluation specialist in the prevention department of the Sitkans Against Family Violence in Sitka, Alaska. Welcome, Amanda. Cynthia Roberts. She's an evaluator with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where she helps to evaluate their 10 Men project, which I hope we'll have a chance, Cynthia, to be able to tap in and learn from you about that. Jeremiah Levine, who is a sexual health educator with a Wise Guys facilitator and a volunteer with Men Edmonton. Shane Foster, who is the Vice President of External Affairs and Men Together at YWCA Nashville in Middle Tennessee. And then Feng Tao, who is the founder and executive director for Man Forward, a national Southeast Asian man and masculine grassroots group that uses community organizing to activate men, boys, and masculine folks to practice new forms and concepts of masculinity and manhood. He also coordinates the statewide engagement of the Men and Masculine Folks Network in Minnesota. I welcome you, Feng and Shane and Jeremiah and Cynthia. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to just kind of give a little bit of an overview about this discussion, because we hope that it's not just kind of your typical panel, Q&A, and then close kind of discussion. We really want to make this an interactive discussion between our panelists, but also with all of you as participants. We are asking that panelists be encouraged to respond to one another, build up on one another's ideas, and also engage in gentle disagreements or constructive engagement where that may exist. Those are always productive and healthy. And then rather than waiting for the moderator to ask questions, we ask that you also ask questions in chat. So please keep the chat box as a live forum where you all can ask questions of one another or on your own perspective and kind of continue that conversation. And we'll try and, both myself and Russ will try and feed that chat conversation into the panel conversation as well. So it does feel a little bit as if, Russ said this earlier, so I'm gonna credit him, but almost as if we're sitting around the kitchen table having coffee or tea or something together. So that's kind of the feel that we want to go with. And so we hope that you'll be able to participate with us. With that, I'm going to be quiet and present and pass along to our esteemed panel to provide about a 2 to 3 minute response to the report, their reactions to this report. I'm wondering what surprised you, what didn't surprise you, what did we miss in this? And what do you see as the implications for the growing male engagement movement in this region? I'm going to go in the order that I had called or introduced you all, just to kind of keep that flow going. But after we've wrapped, I think, Feng, you'll have the last kind of presentation reaction. After that, I really encourage the rest of the panel to open up and respond to one another, or respond to continue to ask questions. So with that, Amanda, I pass it along to you.
Thank you, Apta. Thank you so much. I would just like to start off by recognizing that I am lucky enough to live and work on the unceded land of the Tlingit people, which is currently called Sitka, Alaska. And I would also just like to thank the Tlingit people for being such excellent stewards of this land since time immemorial. So I just want to thank them and Gwynal Chish for that. So kind of where I'm coming from, my lens, I work at a dual domestic violence sexual assault agency. We do both direct services and prevention, and that's kind of where I'm in the primary prevention department. And my title is communications and evaluation specialist. There's no male engagement in that yet. That is a decent part of my job, and that is just kind of for the fact that we don't have a full-time male engagement person that does solely this work. And the reason for that is funding. The reason also for that is our organization, Sickens Against Family Violence, was born, from the feminist movement in the 70s. And so it's not, men, especially adult men, don't necessarily see themselves as a part of this work or as belonging, or they feel as though they don't have a spot in this work, that they would be seen as intimidating. And that has kind of led us to create a program called Boys Run Itu Uklatsin with various other organizations in Southeast Alaska. And that's where our main engagement of men or boys is coming from. And it's an elementary school program. It's for boys 3rd through 5th grade. And it's rooted in Southeast Alaska traditional culture. And basically boys in 3rd to 5th grade learn social emotional skills through the medium of running and learn about culture. And that it's surprising to me on this report, especially, that there was very few as far as culturally like place-based materials or programs. Additionally, the fact that there weren't very many elementary aged programs, just for the fact that coming from a primary prevention lens, we want to increase our increase protective factors and decrease risk factors. And we do that along with our coalition. And the thing is we reach out a lot to elementary age boys because, it's hard to get buy-in from other organizations of different sectors to support a program that's going to be directed towards adult men. I find myself even getting not backlash per se, but having to push in my organization for engaging adult men. And I think, like I said, that comes through this like feminist lens of our organization and what was mentioned in the report, how men and boys are a lot of times defined as the problem, either in terms of perpetrators or enforcers of gender inequality. And so, of course, we engage men in a different identity in this way. So we are engaging boys throughout the program, but then we're also engaging men in the way of coaches, in the way of culture bearers, in ways that they too themselves can internalize what's going on with what they're teaching, but also that they, that they themselves will internalize, but also help the boys, and also the coaches themselves get this like rapport with each other and that connection as well. So trying to engage adult men on the periphery of like the program is kind of a big part of how we engage adult men versus boys. And really kind of shifting away, I really think that evaluation, we have not evaluated our program. We were supposed to be evaluating actually this year, doing a full scale evaluation, and we were unable to due to COVID and having to change implementation on our program. And we, our state, what I'm trying to say is our statewide level, we don't have that sort of like structure. We don't have the capacity at our statewide level. We are a member of the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And so, there's not even a male engagement specialist. So we in the state who are doing male engagement work, we don't have that ability to talk to each other, to really understand what's happening and how you can engage with them. There's not that structure. There's also not that structure for some of our funding that we have, which was something that was brought up in the report. And I think that the report brought up a lot of good points that are clear in that are queer in the field completely. And I would love to have the opportunity to really talk to others about what they do, because we're floating, we're kind of floating. We all don't know where exactly we're going from here, because there isn't this standardized practice. We're all still trying to just give out feelers. So that is a little bit about my response to that report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible, Amanda. Thank you. I want to pass it along to Cynthia to get a little bit of your reactions to the report.
Sure, thank you so much. Well, one thing I wanted to kind of start out by saying was just what an incredible experience it's been already to meet with the people, with Russ and Apta and the folks who are on this panel to prepare for the panel, for the roundtable, as well as the one that's happening on December 9th. Just having the conversations we've already had have just been, they've really just gotten me just very enthused about the report and about the potential that the report will have. So I'm going to highlight a few areas that resonated with me as the evaluator of Rhode Island's efforts. So we're about into our almost 8th year implementing a strategy called 10 Men. And I can share links to it in the chat. And we have been evaluating it all along. It's been a developmental approach to evaluating, because we've also been developing the program, and it's really not a program, it's a strategy. So hearing about the scan and the highlights that were elevated are extremely consistent with where we are developmentally in wanting to bring our work. So we engage men in Rhode Island at different levels of the social ecological model, from the individual all the way through to doing societal level strategies, including policy work and mass media. And then so like outer layer all the way down to like interpersonal and intrapersonal through cohort work and relationship building, network building. So we pretty much touch every level of the social ecological model. And we, through that, have through our practice, so we do reflective practice. So evaluation is really embedded through everything that we do. And we have identified taking an intersectional approach as being sort of like a frontier that we really need to lean into more to just stretch our work more. And also, so that was a theme in the report about leaning intersectionality. And I know that's a theme of this symposium in general. Also, accountability is a big topic of ours. And how, for example, how do we engage men and at the same time center the people most impacted by harm. Probably my favorite issue, like personally in my role in my organization, that I really love and appreciate that was raised through the report, has to do with, as Russ was saying, democratizing the literature, like how we get our knowledge from practice into the literature. So my organization, it's the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We're funded to do our primary prevention work through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And a lot of our evaluation goes back to the CDC, because that's a big component of the funding, because they want to learn about what work looks like. And it takes a long time to get something into like a published form into like the academy. So we tend to focus more on more rapidly utilizable knowledge production, but then that doesn't make it into the formal literature. So it's sort of like this feedback loop of like, how do we get the knowledge that we are producing out there so other practitioners can learn together with us, because we see it as a learning together kind of dissemination. And there are some publications that CDC has contracted that do eventually make their way out, but sometimes it just doesn't have like the level of depth experiences or what we value about the work, because it's for a different audience. So yeah, I just want to really emphasize that personally, I'm really interested in how we not only democratize how we publish things, but how we even, I'm going back to something that the last presenter, I believe it's Unoma Azuah, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it properly, but she was talking about like decolonizing our minds, and she talked about unlearning. And I feel like we have to unlearn a lot about what we think is knowledge and valuing, because so much of what we're doing is very subtle culture change, and it's really hard to pick up in these like pre-post surveys. It just doesn't pick up that level of sensitivity of the change. So I'll stop there with just that extra underscore for decolonizing or democratizing knowledges. And I'm just going to be really excited to talk about whatever else comes up through this panel. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that. That was really great. Thank you. I'll pass it now to Jeremiah to present his reactions and thoughts on the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Apta. Hihani Laki, that's a term for welcome, good morning that I just learned from Greg this morning, so wanted to practice that. My name is Jeremiah Levine, he, him pronouns. I'm from Treaty 6 territory, which is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. It's a traditional gathering place and has been for many Indigenous nations, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and many more for thousands and thousands of years. My mind has been absolutely swimming with everything that I've heard today from Greg, from Unoma, from Russ as well. So I'll try and like bring some coherent points to the conversation while my mind is swimming. One of the things from the report that Russ put together and presented to us today that's been really sticking out for me is kind of like the way that we try to get funding from governments, from states, and the way that these funding arms have already categorized the work that we do into these silos that just don't work for us. Russ was bringing up even like this intersectionality amongst men as men. It's not even talking about intersectionality in terms of men, in terms of race or ability, class, what have you, but just men as men. When we talk about men who are victims or who have experienced violence or who have perpetrated violence or who are bystanders, as Russ was saying, so much of the time, so many men are all three of those at the same time. And yet our funding is chunked out into these categories that are not human. Or in Canada, at least, funding for working against violence or to prevent violence or intervene on violence, there's a funding stream for domestic violence and then a funding stream for sexual violence. Whereas on the ground in communities and families, these things are often happening in conjunction at the same time. And so it's messy and it doesn't work. So when we're talking about like trying to have a holistic movement, it becomes even more difficult. And I think Karen was saying earlier this morning that in this work, we also need to be thinking about capitalism. We need to be thinking about the economic systems that are like kind of deciding how we do the work that we do. And to me, this is a big barrier. It's hard for us to take this power back as communities and do this community building work, do this community healing work when we're already being chunked out into these categories that don't work for us. Another point that I've been thinking about a lot is the phrase and the notion that we need to be meeting men where they're at when we're doing this work. So if we want to work with men to move them along the spectrum from sexism to non-sexism all the way to anti-sexism, we need to meet them where we're at along that journey and help guide them along, which is a really beautiful notion, I think. But at the same time, as Russ mentioned in the report, there's an issue with that. If I'm working with a group of people of many genders and there happen to be men there who might hold some sexist views or may have learned some sexist myths and they want to bring those up, this compromises the safety for people that are suffering from sexism, from women in the room, from trans people in the room, non-binary people in the room. So how do I meet this man where he's at, who might be believing or espousing sexist things, while keeping in mind and keeping like as a high priority the safety of other people in the room. This is a really difficult thing. And what I want to do in like the last minute of my 2-minute spiel here is try and give an example of how I've tried to deal with this. So as Apta mentioned, I teach sexual health classes. I'm a sex ed teacher. So this means that every time that I'm in a classroom, I'm talking about STIs, sexually transmitted infections, or I'm talking about sexual violence or transphobia or homophobia, that just going by the statistics that we have these days, in every classroom, there's always going to be somebody who has transmitted an STI. There's always going to be somebody who has experienced sexual violence or even perpetrated sexual violence. There's always going to be somebody who has experienced transphobia, experienced homophobia, or perpetrated these types of hate. So every time I go in to have these conversations, it's always a really delicate thing. There's always safety being compromised. We like to talk about having safe spaces for these conversations, but unfortunately, that's not realistic. We can try to have safer spaces where we try to make things safer, try to make things more accessible for people. And that's what I try to do. But these oppressive systems that we're here to talk about, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., they're always going to be embodied in individuals and in their individual actions. So whenever I'm in a classroom, I'm talking to students about consent or sexual violence, there's almost always going to be a student, usually male, but not always, who will bring up a myth about sexual violence. They'll raise their hand and be like, oh wait, but I mean, I thought men get falsely accused a lot of the time. What's going on with that? And they might be saying that in a way where they're trying to provoke me because they assume that I disagree with that. And I think that'd be fair for them to assume that. I do disagree with that. It's a myth. Or they might be genuinely asking. They might be genuinely really curious about this. But as soon as this person asks this question and brings up this myth around sexual violence into the room, safety's already being compromised. People in the class who have experienced sexual violence and who have like come up against these barriers of myths might already be feeling triggered, might already be feeling scared, or that like they can't bring this stuff up anymore, or like, oh my God, what happens the next time that I have to like interact with this student in this class after the sex ed guy is gone, right? So things have already been compromised. So what do I do about this? And I think this is where people, including the panelists, might disagree with me on kind of my method here. But when someone brings up a myth, I thank them for it. There's so much taboo and so much shame that goes into all topics around sexual health that the fact that someone even brought this up, I'm like, wow, like you might be joking, you might be throwing this up as a barrier because you're too afraid to actually engage with this topic, but you said something. So thank you for saying that. After thanking them, I very quickly dismantle this myth. I thank them and I'm like, well, thanks for bringing that up. That's actually a really common myth. So we need to talk about that. I'm glad you brought that up to the conversation. So this is something that I've tried. This is something that I found, at least in the classrooms that I've worked with, is really effective. The person, usually male, who's said something awful, they don't feel completely shut down by what I've said. Other people in the room whose safety has been compromised hopefully can hear and understand that I don't want to limit people's participation, but I also do want to let people know when they've said something that crosses the line, or when they say something that is a myth or that contributes to violence, that it is still not okay. I've had a couple instances around homophobia, transphobia, sexual violence where I've tried this method, and I've had students come up to me after the class to thank me for the way that I've handled things, to be like, hey, you were really calm about that. You didn't totally shut that person down, and I felt okay with this too. And I felt like I was seen and acknowledged. So thank you for that. And I'd love to talk more about like any more of these instances and experiences that I've had. And I really look forward to everyone else's opinions on the things that I've shared, if you have any opinions on that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for giving me the space to share all of that.
Thanks so much for that, Jeremiah. I want to pass it on to Shane, but I want to, later on, I want you to remind me that I have a question about if anyone came up to you in anger about what you had done, whether or not they pushed back on that. And so now I'll pass to Shane, but I'm going to come back to you on that one. Shane, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. I'm just really excited to share space with each and every one of you, and hope that I have something of substance to add to this conversation with the other esteemed panelists that are here. Russ, my hat goes off to you and to NAMEN for putting together such a great field study that I really found so much there that resonated with my experience. We've built a program in Nashville, Tennessee called the Men Together, literally from a concept of just engaging men in this community, and have now hosted a national conference, which Russ came and spoke at last year, and then also have expanded our work into 6 other states this year. And it's around this notion that everyone needs a place to plug in. And one of the things that was glaring to me, and some of the other panelists touched on this as well from the study, was that there's not a whole lot of places for everyone to plug in. They have to be in these silos. They have to fit into these buckets, right? They have to fit into these categories in order for them to plug in. There's not enough resources and programming for adults, and there's not enough resources and programming for kids that are below middle school, right? So these are barriers that exist. And if we're actually going to progress towards preventing sexual violence and gender-based violence from happening, we do have to start earlier, but we also have to make sure that there's opportunities for learning, for transformation for adult men as well. There's also a lack of peer networking opportunities. We've talked about this at length in the past, being that we're all doing this work in some place, some way, shape, or form, but there's nothing structuralized that allows us to allow iron to sharpen iron, to learn from each other's experiences, to be able to gain mentorship, to even just be able to vent. You know, a lot of this work is difficult and hard at times, and it takes a level of perseverance to keep going when you come up against barriers and roadblocks, and it's needed. Community is needed even within this type of a movement. We also talked about you know, the need to engage men from various sectors of the community in terms of creating the programming that exists. In Nashville, one of the things that we did, because we had a lot of interest from our religious community, and so we created a program specifically with the United Methodist Men that's called Amending Through Faith. And it's in about 50 churches around the country, and it's a place for men who are in those spaces to plug in. And we've gotten interest to even adopt that into other faith practices as well. But that was something that was in the report. Also talked about the limited funding and the pressure that comes from funders to do things a certain way. I'll tell you that in the first really 5 years of our work in Nashville, we specifically did not go after government funding because we wanted the ability to shape the program around what works in this community, not what a funder is dictating us to do. And in a lot of cases, and we've been very fortunate enough to work with Vanderbilt University on a lot of our research and our best practices as it relates to the curriculum that we're providing for our kids, impacting more than 650 boys here in Nashville in 23 schools. But there's still gaps even in the research, because the research is not composed of everybody's experiences. And so me being a former professional basketball player, I'm probably not going to be interested in programming in schools. If you would have asked me to do this when I was in middle or high school, I would have said no and just kept it moving, just being honest, right? And even, I shared with the panelists when we had a prep meeting, you know, when I first started doing this, I did not think this was going to work, because the people who I had spent my entire life with, they don't do stuff like this. They're not going to the event, they're not going to the program, they're not showing up to the club or whatever the case may be, right? They're just not doing it. And so the approach has to be very different to make sure that everyone truly has a place to plug in. So I think that's important. And also, as we're talking about funders, I think it's important to really understand the difference between a growth mindset and an impact mindset. From a funding standpoint, funders are looking for high numbers. How many people have you done programming with? How many people have you heard your message, or whatever the case may be, not realizing that in some ways we're minimizing the impact that we're able to have because we have to have so many numbers. It's very difficult to have an intimate, vulnerable conversation in a safe space with 100 people. Everybody don't get to talk, and we only got an hour, right? Anybody doing youth work with schools, you get an hour max, right? Like that's just a reality. So if you got 100 kids in the class, yes, from a growth standpoint, everybody's excited about it. You're growing exponentially, doing this and doing that. But are we able to have sustainable impact with these kids? Are we able to maximize this hour and get the stories of these kids? And one of the things that I'm gonna close after this, the thing that I'm most excited about with the work that we do is creating the space for these kids to talk, right? Like this is not about, you know, us just giving them information. And I tell our kids and I tell our facilitators this all the time. My goal is not to produce other advocates. My goal is to make sure that these kids are not abusing other people, including women and girls, right? Like, so if they go their whole life and never do anything in policy, never do anything in advocacy, but they've never abused another person, that's the goal, right? And so that has to be created and facilitated in a very different way than a lot of programs are able to provide.
I think that's such a great point, Shane, and thank you for bringing that up. I've been writing notes because there's so much that I want to be able to talk about too. I just want to quickly check, did we lose Fang? I think he was supposed to be next. Oh no. So you know what, why don't we'll hold off on Fang's presentation until we're able to get him back online. Oh, there he is. Hi, you're back. Fang, we want to pass it along now to you to hear your reactions. And we hope we don't lose you. You have such an important voice into this conversation.
Yeah, sorry. I thought I was plugged into the outlet, but apparently I wasn't.
That happens to me all the time.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am from Minnesota here in the US, and I use he, him pronouns, Peng. And it's good to be with all of you. I think my reaction is, or my thoughts, which has been shared previously, I think in some ways with the other panelists, is ensuring that the engagement of men and boys, masculine identified folks, is really through this like sort of holistic approach. Because I think that one of the things that from the report, it gleans on really getting men to be on board with ending gender-based violence. But I think when we look at culturally specific communities, that's just not the only thing that we have to actually end. That's just not the only thing that men and boys are actually coming to programming for. We did a sort of a similar field report with the Southeast Asian Action Resource Center a few years ago, and their scan found out that a lot of the boys programming in the Asia Pacific Islander communities was embedded in organizations that were doing some type of work that was related to gender, right? But it wasn't organizations that were like specifically addressing gender-based violence issues, but they were doing gender justice work. They weren't just, their organization wasn't fully addressing domestic violence or sexual violence in the way that we're talking about it here, perhaps, or the way in which we are actually thinking about it here. So I think that that's like the intersectional approach that I'm thinking about. And that's also the point to Jeremiah's point about meeting people where they're at, is that as we know, survivors come to domestic violence shelters and to sexual violence programs, not because of what happened to them, but because they also need some other support in some other way. But I think we tend to then magnify it to just that issue. And I think that misses out on the opportunities for us to actually like engage in the totality of what has actually happened in this person's life, the way they've been socialized, the way they've been taught, the way they've been raised in the context of the community that they live in. So for a long time, our work has been really grassroots. And the way in which we've defined community, I think the other part of in the report, it says community-based. And my assumption in the community-based led efforts is that it's really located to geography, to like communities that are in, like, for example, in the St. Paul, Minneapolis, whatever the case may be. But I think when we look at communities that, again, that are culturally specific, we're looking across state lines. We're looking across countries. We're not looking at geographic locations. Hmong people, which is my folks and my community, we live almost all over the world. So we're connected in that way. We aren't centralized to one geographic location. And when we say community, we're saying the entirety of our community, not just geographically here in the Twin Cities only, or in the state. And so I think that that's the other part that I want to emphasize, is that I was surprised to see that a lot of the programs responding to say that they were culturally informed. And then parallel to that, what I didn't see was a lot of culturally specific programs that were mentioned in the report or in the scan, because I do know that there's a lot of culturally specific programs that are out there, and organizations such as ours, Man Forward, that are out there who are doing great work. But it's just in so minute and small ways that sometimes those programs and those efforts don't actually get captured. And when they do get captured, their tactics, quote unquote, and their activities and the way in which they approach and do this work isn't often lifted up as visible, because it's not in alignment to what everybody is doing. It's not in alignment to what mainstream folks and other major organizations who have attention who are doing, as a report named in terms of the peer review that organizations and activities that get funded through funding, because those are the strategies that work, like the Coaching Men to Boys curriculum, the ways in which funding gets directed at college organizations, because and college-based engagement, because that's where some of the funding goes. And so those things drive that. And so I'm just naming these things because these are some of the things that are coming to my mind as I read the report. And then I think the other part of it is when we are talking about engaging men and boys and masculine identities, it's also really about, for us in our work, is really about ensuring that folks have an analysis around this, no matter where they are and what they are doing in their own lives, right? The way in which they may impact people who are most impacted in their communities, that they have a good analysis before they make any decisions that they're going to make. And they understand how the decision as a masculine and a man person and a male person, that it impacts the women and girls and female and feminine folks in their community, right? That they understand that. So our approach is not like, not everybody has to be hired, right? And not everybody has to be paid to do this work. But we want you to have this analysis, and that's where our engagement is going to be, is that. And I think that variation that the report is talking about in terms of not having standardized practices and engagement strategies, I like that part, for one, because that allows for the innovation to keep happening. That drives that innovation. Once we start having best practices and we start having evidence-based practices instead of practice-based evidence, then we start to become more standardized, and the funding then helps drive those pieces. And then you lose the innovation. You lose the groups that are doing the on the ground work, who are really innovative in this work, right? Who are doing really transformative work, who are doing really hard relationship and in-depth cultural shifting, changing hearts and minds of men and masculine folks in community, right? So that was one of the pieces that I also wanted to lift up. I think the other part that I wanted to really share briefly too is the networking piece, and I hear that throughout the report a whole lot, and I think that that's very valuable and that's very true, is that similar to the space that we're in right now, is that we don't get those opportunities, right? As practitioners, as people who are doing this work, however you define the work, people who are leading it, whatever role that you're playing, is that we don't get the spaces to connect and to really think and to really build on the analysis that we each have, and to build on the places of tension that we also have with one another, and to also see where the blind spots are as well too. And so I think that that opportunity for sure is really lacking. And so I think that that's one of the things that I really want to highlight too, is that networking piece. And one of the reasons why we started the Men and Masculine Folks Network in Minnesota, in our reinvention of it, was really to look at uplifting the strategies that are actually embedded in the community, right? And doing and having the ability for people to actually do that kind of a cross networking and sharing and peer support to each other, because we know that the men and masculine folks who are doing this work in their community need that kind of support and need spaces where they can actually just come and be like, oh, let me just take a breather here and let me just relax here or whatever. And so through that, what we do is we do, not this past year because of the pandemic, but we do a yearly retreat that allows for the practitioners to come together to build on their thinking and to build on their analysis further, right? So that's the other part that I wanted to mention. But that's my reaction.
I realized I was just talking on mute. Sorry about that. I want to thank you, Peng, for that great reaction, and thank you so much. I think I've been pronouncing your name wrong, so I want to apologize publicly for that. But I want to kind of now open it up to a larger discussion to have everyone kind of build and react. I mean, I had so many different thoughts that I can start to bring in to that. And Shane, I don't know if you've noticed, there's been a really great conversation in the chat box right now about what you were discussing around faith leaders and the faith movement. So please keep that chat going, and I can bring that into the conversation a little bit more. But I want to start with just kind of thinking, and you all kind of touched upon it a little bit, but thinking about like, how does what we've seen in this report, like, what does it say about our values as either organizations, individuals, or as a field? Because I think what you do, what you fund, what you put visibilize on a platform says a lot about how you feel. And there's something that's not aligning with how we think we're expressing our values and what's actually being expressed to the larger public. So how does that resonate with you all? What are you feeling there? And also, please, if you want to just ignore my question and respond to something that someone else said, please go forward.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to that, because it sort of creates an opportunity for a certain thread that it's just like a thread of interest and tension, and just like a place of, I don't know, like creative solutions. But so in Rhode Island, our 10 Men initiative, the purpose is to identify men who want to be visible, like agents of change and kind of examples of healthy masculinity in action in their communities and on a state level. So every year we recruit a cohort, it's usually around 10 men. And the hope, and this has been an emergent developing approach, but the hope is that after a year of being in this cohort, which involves some education and like peer learning, peer support, convening, informal convening, like socializing sort of outside of the formal spaces, having an in-depth retreat, doing a summit, having a community conversation. There's like certain components to what we do that have developed in large part because of the participants in the cohort and their ideas and our evaluation of that. But one challenge that we've run into, and it's not like a straightforward solution, and it has to do with exactly what Russ highlighted in his overview of the report findings, and that others like Shane and Jeremiah have lifted up, is that like people, all of us, and Peng also mentioned it, like we're complex, like we're either like perpetrators or like beacons of healthy masculinity, or, you know, or something all along a continuum that way. So in Rhode Island, because the approach was, it's not a like straight up education approach. It's not like trying to educate people about like gender-based violence as the goal. It's to visibilize, kind of like what you were saying, to like make visible the values around gender equity and like gender equity in action, and what does that look like? So through our work, we've been learning ourselves, like through the men doing their work in their spheres of influence, what that can look like. And we've also recognized that there can be, so it's not an evidence-based approach at all, it's truly just like developmental and emergent, that there can be some dogma like from the field, from say like domestic violence or other kind of curricular approaches that kind of want to standardize these approaches versus letting them be more organic and humanistic. And that's what part of why I'm lifting this up is in our situation where we're also saying that these men are actually examples of healthy masculinity in action, like in our state, to try and elevate what that could look like. There feels like there's also this tension between how do we co-create or steward values in action that help signal like what is like a shared sense of how that fits. And part of why I'm saying that is related to religious values that might actually be counter to things like being LGBTQ plus inclusive. So yeah, it's a messy kind of situation. So I guess I'm not proposing a solution, but one thing I did want to share, one process that we developed along the way in terms of inviting people to be in the cohort is that in a like an interview process, if folks had attitudes that were like counter to our values, where we would be spending a lot of time either trying to like change people's opinions about those or counter them all the time, like we just decided we can't have like certain values showing up in the way that we're conceiving of our work. And I'm not saying that we're saying it's not okay to feel that way, because that's reality. Like society has a lot of values that are counter to the work. For us to be a 10-man man, we would not actively be recruiting people who would actively have values that were not aligned with our organizational values and with our with our approaches to doing the work. So I just wanted to put that out there. Yeah, there's a lot more, but that's just one piece.
One of the things that I kind of like to piggyback on with Cynthia's comments is that I agree with you so much. We're all flawed, right? Like literally, no one is perfect. It's a cliche, you know, and we say it all the time, but do we actually embrace it when it rubs up against other people's flaws? Like it's all good when we're flawed because we want grace. But when other people's flaws show up, then we're like, you can't do that here. Or if you want to be a part of this, you got to show up differently. So it's my job to teach you how to. And the reality is people change, transformation happens over time, right? And so if we are acting as if, you know, the only people who we hold space for are those who share our values, those who share our same beliefs, those who get on board, then I wouldn't be a part of this movement. Because prior to me being a part of this movement, I knew nothing about gender-based violence. I knew nothing about, you know, LGBTQ plus. I knew nothing about intersectionalities. I knew nothing about these things, right? And in fact, being a professional athlete, playing ball my whole life, I was around toxic masculinity 100% of the time. I grew up in this space, right? And so by virtue of creating these categories that we need to be able to put people in order for it to make sense to us, we do what's happening in our world around us, that is creating segregations of people, right? And even within engaging men work, we're segregating people. And that just, not only does it feel wrong, but it's counterintuitive to what we're actually trying to accomplish, right? And so as it relates to, doing the work, whether it's in religious spaces, it's in LGBTQ plus communities, it's regardless, we as a organization doing this work, and I heard somebody say this earlier, we got to be more inviting, right? Let's be on this journey together. I'm not inviting you because I figured it out. No, that's not why I'm inviting. I'm inviting you because what I've learned is that there's some great things about manhood and masculinity that I think I need to hold on to, but there's some things that I've gotten wrong.
Yeah.
There's some things that are harmful to other people. There's some things that are hindering me from being a holistic person, right? There's some things that are causing me to not get the full value of the relationships that I value, right? And so to the extent that we can be more inviting, I think it would really go a long way.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is messy work. It's a journey that we're on. We're evolving, and as long as we're learning from, I think it's important. But I also want to just uplift a question from the chat. Stuart asked Shane, who introduced you to this new space for you?
So the YWCA of Nashville, where I'm currently at now, I had just finished playing ball in Europe and in LA, and came back to Nashville, and I knew I wanted to do something that made a difference in other people's lives. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I helped to start a charter school here in Nashville, and did some work there for 2 years. And they were starting this program after hearing Tony Porter and Jackson Katz talk. They started thinking about, how do we do this in Nashville? How do we engage men in Nashville? And they were looking for somebody to run the program. And because of my reputation and network in Nashville, people felt like I had the integrity to be able to do this. And so they reached out to me and said, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Would you be interested? And I said, I don't believe this is going to work, but sure, let's try it. And one of the things that happened very quickly was, the more I started talking about this, I didn't see people changing immediately, but I saw people interested in something that I didn't think was even possible, right? Like, I've been around like the most toxic folks, right? And they were like, you know what, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know what, this is what happened to me when I was a kid, and I've never been able to talk about it. I had adult men crying with tears in their eyes, talking about experiences that they've had and how they watched their father be abusive to their mother, and that's just how they've operated. Guys talking about how they just don't know any better, right? Nobody's taught them how to be respectful, how to respectfully find somebody attractive, or how to date. Nobody's talking about these things. And then the more I talk to kids, I found out that they're in a space 100% of the time where people are talking at them, but nobody wants to listen. Nobody cares about what their experience is like at home, and what community they come from, what they saw growing up, and how that impacts them. Nobody cares about their definition of masculinity for themselves, right? But they got a lot of people talking at them. And so, I got all in, and it also triggered in me, my own life experiences. I have a mother, a grandmother, I have sisters who have all been in abusive relationships, and having 6 siblings, 2 brothers and 4 sisters. Just like I don't want my sisters being abused, I also don't want my brothers being perpetrators of this kind of violence. And so what better way to stop it than to get involved in it?
Yeah. I think all of us probably have someone in our lives. If we have not been the victims of abuse or violence, we know people in our lives who have been that, and that really should compel us to move forward. Amanda, I saw you nodding and really enthusiastically engaged. I want to bring you in here because I want you to voice some of your thoughts as well.
Yeah, just kind of going off what Shan was saying, this like really big issue of categorization, especially working in a domestic violence sexual assault organization with a shelter. Shelter does not include, men are not allowed there. Granted, we do direct services for men and we will put them in a hotel, but just that alone is enough to turn them off completely. They don't even want to volunteer. This is not for men. This is not an organization they even want to go into.
And I just wanted to say, like, Amanda, that also starts early. Like, there are some shelters, not necessarily here in the US, but globally, where if a mother brings her children, the son is above the age of puberty, the son will not be allowed in. So it starts at an early age where we start to kind of normalize this idea of kind of sexuality and like predator-like belief. But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, yeah, and it's true. And you know, I've brought up like having one room in our shelter. If there is a man that needs it, like it's dedicated and it would be there if they do need it, and it's like separated. And there's a lot of this whole just good guy, bad guy thing. You know, that's not a thing. You're not either a good guy or a bad guy. There's so many more nuances to that. And what does that mean? You could be a perpetrator. You could also be a victim. You need help from us in that way. And when you come to us, you know, maybe you're coming to us as a victim and not a perpetrator. It's just how do you even begin to unravel that? I don't even know how to explain to men or even the women, and we're all women at my organization, the women in my organization, that this is important and that male victims matter, male identifying victims matter. You know, we're fighting to stop violence. We're not just fighting to stop violence against women. We're fighting to stop violence against men, violence against women, violence against everyone, and also male on male violence. But yeah, it's a big issue with our. I don't know where to go from here.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, and I think it negates we know that there are cycles of violence. We know that, you know, witnessing violence in childhood for both men and women have deep impacts going forward to their likelihood of tolerance and perpetrating violence on both, like across the board. And so when we talk about that, or we exclude some, we really are negating some of their own experiences as well. And I just want to keep this conversation really open and flowing. So whoever wants to jump in, please jump in. I mean, I'm happy to also uplift another comment from Stuart, who is, it's not a competition, but is one of our star chatters, kind of asking, really talking about inviting to all versus safety of all in the same space is the conundrum. There is that balance of, and Stuart, I want to kind of uplift that because there's also recently a UN Women publication written by Michael Flood and Alan Gray, which we can also share in the chat, that also talks about this discussion about engaging men and boys, and talks about that balance and that seemingly conflict or competition between, you know, calling out perpetrators and specifically men for their privilege and for complicity in these spaces, but also wanting to not make them defensive, not isolate them, not exclude them, and bring them in. And how do you balance that? And sometimes leaning one way or the other in a way that can anger others, which is why I asked Jeremiah about whether or not anyone felt angry by him kind of being kind to that person who had brought that myth in. Like, I felt like if I had been in that classroom as a young girl, I would have been like, what? Like, don't acknowledge him, he's stupid. Like, I may not have said that to you, but I would have probably gone in and been like, yo, Mr. Levine is whacked. Like, I don't understand what's going on here. But that's kind of why I was thinking about that, and like that sense of either or. I don't know if Jeremiah wanted to respond to that, but I can also, but I'd love to kind of hear from some others what their thoughts about that violence. Yeah, and Koru mentioned men who are abusers were once victims themselves. I think that is a complex reality that we have to face. Shane J, one of our board members, and has also asked, how do we foster collaboration as opposed to competition in this space that has so many complex narratives? I really think that's a great question. Shane, you have your mic off. Or
Yeah, I think to answer that question from Shane, it's complex because of the way funding works, right? Like here in Nashville, for example, we're in Tennessee. It's the volunteer state. Philanthropy is at all-time high here. Like, however, nonprofits are competing for the same dollars every single year, right? And when funders are expecting growth, right, that means that as we do this work, our budgets are increasing annually. We go from, whatever your budget is, for example, we were at a $4 million budget as an agency, turned into a $7 million budget. Why? Because funders are not always interested in funding current work or sustaining the work that you're currently doing. They're often more interested in what's the shiny new toy? What are you doing new? How many more people can you engage? What is new? So we're always in a place of growth where it's very difficult to stop and focus on collaboration, to stop and focus on impact, to stop and focus on, and the pandemic has been horrible for so many people and for so many reasons. The one thing positive that has happened for our program as it relates to the pandemic is it allowed us a chance to stop and breathe, right? And to really hone in on some of those partnerships, those community partnerships that we have, to really be able to, stop and partner with Vanderbilt to look even closer at our research and what we're doing and how effective is it being and how we're measuring what we're doing, the impact of what we're doing, like all of those things that, had we not been in a pandemic and everything switched to being virtual, I may not have had the time to do, right? I literally was able to take 2 weeks and do strategic planning. What? I hadn't done that in all 7 years I've been at the 1W. Like, you just don't have the time to do it because you're always flying the plane while you're building it, right? And so that's a very complex question.
You're getting a lot of love from Shane in the chat, Shane. Jeremiah, Fang, what are some of your thoughts hearing some of what's going on?
I was thinking, what came to my mind is that in this work, in that balancing act, is you have to love and hate men at the same time to be able to do it. And I think that that's a tension point when we do this work, is that you either have to hate them and do all the accountability that you can in one end of the spectrum, or you love them so much that you then collude with them in the violence that actually happens, right? And I think both are possible. Both are very possible, that you could actually love men and masculine folks so much. And some of us, are in love with men, and that's okay, all of those things. And so we have to check those places of homophobia that creep in for those of us who are identifying as cisgender and straight men who do this work, right? We have to check our places of transphobia for those of us who are cisgender and straight men who are doing this work, that creep into how we are actually doing accountability, how we are actually doing the invitation that Shane was talking about. In the accountability part of it, we had a conversation a few weeks ago through the Men and Masculine Folks Network, because we host a bi-weekly conversation, what we call kitchen table conversations, where it's just 5 of us having conversations about anything that's current to men and masculine folks and the current environment and context. And we talked about accountability in the way in which I shared that we have to ask ourselves, is what I'm doing enough, right? Instead of why isn't this enough yet? Why isn't what I'm doing enough yet? But rather it should be the reverse of that, where it's like you're constantly in this place as a privileged man and masculine person to be asking the question of, am I doing enough, right? Is what I'm doing enough, and is it stopping the violence, right? The conditions in the environment that allows for the violence to actually happen. So to me, in the imitation of men and masculine folks coming in the balancing act, it's that we can love and rejoice with men and care and do emotional labor with men and masculine folks, and at the same time really push them, right? So that is why when we look at healing for men and masculine folks in these spaces, we have to have more than one person holding that space, right? You can't just have myself be the facilitator and the one that's leading it. Healing work isn't just one person holding all the energy in that room. It requires all of us in this room at this moment to hold each other and to hold the space for somebody to cry, like Shane was talking about, and to unload. And it can't just be one person holding that. It has to be all of that. And I think that that's why in the report, it talks about this work being sort of somewhat slow and somewhat not like the quantity part of it, because we know that the transformation part that Shane was talking about earlier takes so much work, right? And it's not just about inviting 200 people into this space and giving them this talk and then be like, oh, we've changed their mind. No, you haven't done crap at all, right? Because it really takes the relationship piece, it takes the undoing part. And I bet that every one of us in some ways continues to do that and continues to do that internal dialogue and reflection for ourselves, right? But you have to love yourself in it. And then you also have to admit to the places where you actually don't love for yourself as well too, you know?
Can I ask the panel a question?
Of course.
I'd like to ask your thoughts on, is it possible to hold someone accountable that you don't have a relationship with?
I very much think it's possible, Shane. I just kind of doubt how effective it might be compared to holding someone accountable in like a loving, compassionate way, which again is really difficult with someone that you do know, right? The example that I often think of is the work that I've done in schools. And also just having been a student when I was younger, like whenever a teacher or someone in an authority position tells you that something is wrong, maybe you'll stop talking, maybe you'll stop doing that thing, but a lot of the time we're not really convinced. So like the work that I want to do, and I think the work that all of us want to do when we're engaging with people or engaging with men particularly, is that we don't just want to be policing or shaming men for embodying patriarchy, reinforcing it. Like we want them to understand. We want them to kind of answer their own calling to be a better person or to be a better man, however they view themselves. And not just see it from a point of being like, oh, well, the feminist dude leading the exercise is shutting me down again. Guess I should just stop talking. And I definitely want to hear everyone else's thoughts on this, but I'd love to speak so much more as to what Apta brought up like 5 minutes ago about like how our values are being seen by, I guess, like wider society or other people. I think that's a huge factor. The way that non-feminist and anti-feminist people view feminism makes it harder for us to go into a space that is not a feminist space or not a social justice space and start talking about toxic masculinity, for example. And I have so much more to say about that, but I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say about, you know, accountability.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I'm here thinking about like, it depends, I think, on what your theory of change is too, because I know for myself, when I think about accountability and what this change looks like and how to even measure it or even conceptualize it, I think about my own work, you know, over decades in how to like learn to be an aspiring anti-racist person in the world. And like, that does not happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by someone telling you what to do. It happens by building on your own intrinsic motivation and then acting out in your spaces and doing your own internal work. So the theme about numbers and like evidence-based programs and all of that, and like, how do we measure it, and, you know, its impact versus quantity. My answer to like a lot of these things is it's more questions. So it's things like, how as a field can we normalize the fact that this growth is very slow, and it's relational, and it's networked, and it's incremental, it's subtle, it's about stories of transformation. And like, how do we translate what we learn about that into whether it's lessons learned or impacts that we can describe, you know, to other folks trying to do the work, or people trying to understand the work, or even for ourselves who are doing the work, what that change looks like. Because we have found through many focus groups and key informant interviews and things that men will often come to the table and they want to see like action as the result. Like they're like pushing us for action and these kind of visible things. And they often tell us at the end of a cohort that the thing they didn't expect was how much deep personal change they would experience in their own lives. Like they kind of came in thinking like, I want to do this like policy championing, or, you know, work in my church and circles in my own church. But then they're like, wow, I really came to know these other 9 men around the table with me and care about them, and also have relationships with the staff who are implementing this. And just like right now, I'm percolating on this idea of like slowing down and really taking stock of the richness. And we at Rhode Island Coalition have had a similar experience that Shane described with the pandemic. We have paused our newest cohort, and we're really just like looking back on the last 7 years of data and reflections to really think about like, how are we going to move into this next kind of part of our work. So even this conversation is really timely to inform how we're thinking about moving that along. And I guess the other thing I want to add, it has to do with feminism. It has to do with white feminism and the harm, like carceral feminism. Even in the United States, the funding that created the coalitions, even talking about like coalitions to end domestic violence. Like in our primary prevention work, we really try and focus on like what we want to see. And I just want to bring up that there is this inherent tension between stopping something versus like promoting the health and the healing that we want to see in our community.
Thanks for that. I'm just kind of looking really quickly at the time. I know we have about 15 minutes left for this conversation. So I think this is great, but I just want to bring us to a little bit more of a macro level, because one of the things that's been a critique about accountability for the field or for the movement, Russ had brought that up during during the presentation, as one of the findings from the State of the Field, as well as some other work that the Global Secretariat of MenEngage has also noted and talked about a lot, is that we tend to focus a lot on individuals, or the individualized level, and like the almost domesticating the work of engaging men and boys in gender equality, and that we lose sight of addressing these or targeting like patriarchal systems. So, you know, we're asking men to be complicit, or no, to acknowledge their complicity and then address that. But are we actually changing the systems to allow for that? And so I'd love for you all to respond to that and talk a little bit more about how can we, if this is a really strong critique and a really important critique for all of us in our work, how can we better acknowledge that in the work that we're doing?
Well, one of the things I always say is that you can't create change where you don't have relationships. When you're not engaged, you're just doing like the teachers did in school, pointing fingers, right? And nobody likes that, right? Nobody. Systems are the same way. Nobody likes those who point fingers. If you create the relationship, now we can sit down and talk because there's engagement on both sides, right? One of the things that we've been very intentional about in Nashville is creating the relationships not only with community partners, but with the police department, with our mayor's office, with our legislatures. So we've actually had the opportunity to be able to provide training for sexual harassment and violence prevention in all of those spaces, right? And because of the relationship now, when we go in and try to do advocacy work and really talk about policies and the systems that are in place, they're more apt to listen and change can take place because now we have a seat at the table as opposed to just solely pointing out the flaws. Systems are just like people. We're all flawed, right? But when you have the relationship, then you can go in and talk transparently about those flaws and come up with applicable solutions.
Wondering if anyone else has any thoughts on that. Stephen in the chat has said, you know, this is where I think it's important to include in our mission, engaging people of all genders in transforming masculinity and dismantling patriarchy, rather than just to engagement in boys, because I agree that it's important to implicate that framework within this. And Riss is asking, what do the social, organizational, community environments that support men and boys to be engaged look like? And I might even take that a step forward if I were to say, so what does taking on the patriarchal systems, what does that look like for us? And I'm also thinking about my own critiques of that framework in that moving away from individualized approaches, because the impacts are felt on the individual level. You know, this violence, even as it happens because of structural issues, I feel it. My family feels it, and like people in my community feel it. So how do we respond to that those individual emotions and impacts and trauma, while still kind of giving us that support? That might have been too many questions at once.
Yeah, I'd love to add about the policy level, sort of environmental level change work. So I'm not sure what all coalitions in the US are like, but the Rhode Island Coalition definitely works on policies that are not directly, distinctly related just to violence, but to root causes. So things like supporting raising the minimum wage, or supporting frontline workers in healthcare systems, or supporting economic supports for families, greening urban spaces. So we're visibly involved in like upstream policy initiatives. And when we do our 10-men cohort year, we really include our own organizational values around aspiring anti-racism and aspiring anti-oppression lenses to everything. So I feel like we center our work in a context that's embedded in more in a systems approach versus just individuals.
I think that my thinking on the involving the systems and trying to change the systems is somewhat looking at it in terms of like, sometimes some of these systems don't actually work, and no matter how much you reform, how much you change them, they're still going to be the same. So sometimes I am in the camp of like, screw those systems, we're going to create something else over here. And can we be that bold? Can we be that radical, right? Without the resources that are going to support that, if we're looking at the funding resources, because funding doesn't drive that kind of innovation in social justice movement. Funding drives that in kind of innovation in corporations and in the corporate sector. But in social justice movements, those kinds of boldness and those kinds of innovation that are seen to be very radical don't get driven. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes I'm in that camp of like,
Mhm.
I'm not going to do a lot of work to reform the system or to change the system. So for example, like in my community, we have an organization called the 18 Clan Council. And in various states, it's different formations. But what it is that it's a representation of all the last names of Hmong people that live here in the US, right? That they send their representative leaders to that council, and that council predominantly is made up of men who are cisgendered and straight for the most part, who makes a lot of decisions that impact a lot of people and individually and families and a lot of women's lives and queer folks' lives. But that system has not ever been open to the kind of constructive generative conversations where it can actually open its doors and borders and practices up in ways that can be critical. And so what we found is a lot of the Hmong women folks who've been doing this work is that it's better for us to not utilize that system and create other kinds of opportunities and create other kinds of systems that allows for survivors to actually receive justice that actually matters to them instead of going through that place and that system, right? So that is sometimes where I'm at when we look at systems, because on top of that, when we look at the broader society, right, then we have to look at all the other forms of oppression that then impact the community and impact the lives of the queer folks and the women folks in our community too, right? And sometimes those things don't work.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's a really good point. And I mean, one thing I've heard you all touch upon, but I didn't bring out was kind of the issue of funding, about funders and donors. And, you know, maybe, I wonder if it's too simplistic to say, like, let's put the blame on the funders, but, you know, there is, you know, how do we bring them into this conversation? We have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if anyone from the chat has any more questions or from the audience has more questions. I haven't seen too many, but I do want to at least end on kind of getting final thoughts, because this symposium has been about intersectionality and decolonization. And our the presenter right before us shared some amazing memories and stories and information around decolonization. And I'm wondering, how do we integrate? How do we decolonize our own work? What does that look like in practice? I mean, how do we actually build that in a way that's visible, is responsive and accountable? So I don't expect like a long, deep synthesis. I kind of threw this question at you all, but if you can give a couple of last thoughts on all of this, that would be great. And then we'll pass to Russ to close us out. Who wants to go first, or do I have to call on somebody? Amanda, I'm calling on you again.
Man.
Oh, I don't have to be so mean to you twice today. So look, I can go on to someone else if you want. Jeremiah, do you want to go? And then Amanda, you have a couple of minutes to think about it.
Yeah, I can share a couple quick thoughts that I have about this. Trying to integrate decolonial practices or decolonial aims into the work that we're doing, engaging men, trying to prevent gender-based violence, doing feminist work. The place for me to start is that I need to acknowledge that I'm a settler on the lands that I'm on. So I'm very, very new. I feel like I'm in like the incubating phase and learning about decolonial practices, learning more about some of the practices around sexual health and justice, and like gendered relations that indigenous nations have been practicing and growing and building for millennia on the lands that I'm on right now. So for me, and I think other people in this movement, that's one of the first steps. We need to learn more. And this can help us imagine so many other possibilities that I never would have learned in like the settler tradition that I've grown up in. And this can help us think of new ways to practice justice and to build justice and accountability into our movements, into our classrooms, into our communities. So I think for the most part, that's what I would want to say. I think that we should also try to dream of ways that we can include everybody into these movements and into these communities that we want to build. I'm not saying that decolonial practices do that or exclude anyone. As far as I understand them, they do not. But something that I wanted to bring up earlier is that not only are we dealing with people who are non-feminist or non-racist, but are also like sexist or racist. We're dealing with so many people who do not agree with our values of justice and the way that and the communities that we want to build. But we're also dealing with powerful institutions that try to really stoke the flames.
Yeah.
This sort of struggle. Bell Hooks 30 years ago, 40 years ago was talking about how sexism is not about a gender war of women versus men. But the mainstream media has kind of co-opted these movements for justice and is turning it into that and stoking these flames of division. So we see that happening again. So many people who know even less than I do about decolonial practices would think that like, oh, I'm white or I'm not indigenous, so you're just saying I don't belong here and I need to stop talking or I need to like go away somewhere. Not necessarily the case, right? So I think that in the work that we do, whether it's feminist work, more holistic justice work, decolonial work, we not only need to keep in mind people that are going to disagree with us or people that aren't quite there yet, but we also need to keep in mind that there's very, very strong institutions that are working towards maintaining this division between us. So so much work we have to do, right?
Absolutely. Shane, you wanted to add on?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to be a little radical and just say that I really think it's about both and, not either or. And, you know, as we talk about the need for more collaboration, the need for more peer networking, a need for more, all of these things, right? One of the flaws that I think we have in this movement is we try to take on doing too much single organizations because they're so, you know, every time we go into another conversation, it's like, well, that's important. We're not doing that. We need to figure out a way to add that. When if we were able to truly collaborate, then I don't have to get outside of my lane in order to make sure everybody is included. I can call Russ, I can call Jeremiah, I can call Ahmed, and they say, hey, let's do something together. You bring what you bring to the table, I bring what I bring to the table, and now everybody's included, right? And so it has to be more about inviting that kind of both and scenario as opposed to either or as it relates to how we do our individual work in sectors of our communities.
Thank you so much for that. We are at time, but I just want to give Amanda, Cynthia, Peng, if you have any kind of burning last thoughts that you want to share with us.
Yeah, so my final thought has to do with the funder gaze. So we might talk about the male gaze or the white gaze, but there's the funder gaze, how we do or don't structure what we do based on what, like sort of that gaze. And also thinking about unlearning a lot about proving value and worth of our work and how we demonstrate that again to funders, because a lot of this is possible in some ways because we are funded to do it. And how do we advocate up to our funders about what we know are the approaches we want to be using?
Thank you for that, Cynthia.
I'll just say real quick, I guess the last minute comment is that with kind of going back to decolonizing things, I mean, acknowledging where you're from when you're in a meeting, things like that. Well, I mean, what land you're on, that was something new that I learned, that I'm not originally from Alaska. I moved here in 2016. So it's something that it reminds me and kind of grounds me in where I'm at, and that I am not, this is not my land. And it kind of just brings me back and allows me to remember that there are other ways of living that are just as valid, and probably some that are better than mine. And there's strength. There's so much strength in that uniqueness. And that would make a collaboration even stronger, like Shane was saying. So thanks.
Thank you. Russ, you want to take it away? I think you might still be on mute.
Yeah, unmute myself. Is kind of my response. I kind of expected that my mind would be blown, my heart would be blown open by listening to this conversation, and that's exactly what happened. I think one of the things that I consistently heard in this conversation that I want to really highlight is the tensions that exist and the value in talking about those tensions, right? The tension of meeting men where they're at, and what do we do with the fact that some of the men, like me, is somewhat problematic in terms of meeting me where I'm at, and how do we bring men along to a process of the change. The tensions of this notion of having standards versus, what'd you say, Cynthia, having dogma, and kind of this last point around having some of decolonizing is I submit to you that we all are practicing this work based on some standards. And I know to my own self that if I don't articulate them, then my default is white, masculinist, patriarchal, white supremacist standards, because that's how I grew up. And so part of me in terms of decolonizing my practice, back to that question, is actually articulating what are the standards that I'm using to base my work, and interrogating them to the degree to look at, okay, so to what degree are they really based on the values that I say I believe in, versus the values that I've inherited by growing up white in a white supremacist world, male in a male supremacist world. I'm in a long-term heterosexual world. I don't identify as het, but I'm in a long-term heterosexual relationship, so I get all of those privileges, right? So it's about the lack of opportunity that we've had as a movement to actually have space to talk about. There are real tensions here. And I believe in this kind of collective process and the beautiful creativity that emerges by having some brilliant people in the room together to share how we collectively address those tensions. We're not going to solve them. Cynthia, I love your point that sometimes the answers are more questions. And let's go there. Let's kind of go back to that space of being playful and fun and invigorating with this. The vision that we have should be a fun vision. It should be a playful world. Gender justice, racial justice is playful. It's a dance. And do we have the space to feel that fun and that pleasure and those dance movements in our movement building? Or are we so hammered down by the program structure of creating a new program and finding the evaluation data and getting it published and getting it done, and Shane, to your point, building the next shiniest plane, that we don't even have time to dance with each other anymore? So I so love this conversation. I want to make, as a last point, a note that we are having a parallel conversation. NAMEN is hosting a parallel conversation with another group of phenomenal folk on December 9th. Go to the NAMEN website and you can find out more information. And one last pitch, if you value this conversation and what it does, please consider making a donation to support NAMEN and our ongoing efforts. Thank you to the panelists. You all were fabulous. I really want to give each of you a big old warm in-person hug. So grateful for what you brought and your just sense of self that you all brought into the room. Thank you, APTA, for your amazing job at facilitating this, moderating this space. And thank you to the Global MenEngage Alliance for supporting, the Global Secretariat for supporting this work. And I don't know who I turn it over to now.
Such a great discussion, Russ. Thank you so much. I felt your virtual hug. I actually really felt it. I don't know if you saw me tilt a bit, but I felt that hug all the way from here. And I see in the chat just everyone saying, let's keep this discussion going. Let's keep this discussion going. We could talk about this all day. And I do believe we could. And like you said, some of the answers are more questions and conversations. And, as much as we all wish we could be in person, a part of me feels like the fact that it was online, we were able to have more of us here, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
we were able to do that. So I tried to be grateful for the data and all the comments and all the great questions that came up, and the report had so much in there, and a lot of things that even Shane said when he said, hey, I'm going to be a little bit disruptive. I'm like, Shane, disruptive? Never. You know, and some key points about, you know, nonprofit, just wanting to think future forward instead of what we're doing right now. A lot of the things that Cynthia said and Fang, and I love when Fang said, we can't just talk here and think it's over. That's, like he said, what do you say? BS. Like it's not, right? So I think he just wants an excuse to get back together again, right?
Well, and if I could just bounce off that, Karen, really quickly, again, that's the point of this report. You know, the intention is not for this to then be published and we put on a shelf somewhere. The hope is from NAMEN is that this report is actually a catalyst for these kinds of conversations and ongoing opportunities to really continue thinking about and exploring where are we at in terms of this work, and how do we more strategically think about building our movement forward.
Yeah, you got it. I love it.
Across the region.
Across, and even Alaska, even up in Alaska. Up in Alaska.
We are a part of the United States.
Okay.
Stamps are still the same price.
And after that, such a great facilitation. That was just great. So many things came to the forefront. Just loved all the great engagement that we had. That was just such a wonderful, 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 informative piece. So I can't wait to keep this conversation going. Speaking of can't wait, I can't wait to see Cliff Leek's face. I just miss Cliff. I need to see Cliff. I need me some Cliff right about now. For those of you who don't know, Cliff is one of the board members who's going to help us with some closing last words. Cliff is awesome. He's the vice president of the American Men's Studies Association, and a lot of his research focuses on ways in which people in positions of privilege engage in social justice activism. So Cliff, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we're going to say some awesome final words. I don't even know where you're going to start. Where are you going to start, man?
The thinking about where to start was a tough one. And so I ultimately decided to go sort of chronologically through the day.
Start with me.
Well, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for your leadership over the last 2 days. I know that this certainly would not have looked the same without you. So thank you so much for that. I wanted to thank everyone for attending and participating in day 2 of this symposium on decolonization and intersectionality. I know that I've thoroughly enjoyed seeing how engaged everyone has been in the chat and learning so much from the experience and wisdom of the various presenters and panelists. We started off this morning with a really beautiful opening ceremony led by Greg Greycloud. In that ceremony, we were really invited to think in new ways about how we navigate challenges and difficulties in life in supportive and healthy ways and in relationship with others. The relationship piece that was demonstrated in that opening ceremony was really powerful to me. And that opening ceremony led into a really deeply moving presentation on colonization by Unoma. That presentation raised some really important reflections and questions for me. As a person who has many privileged identities, the concept of decolonizing our minds and unlearning oppressive behaviors was especially poignant for me. It was a sharp reminder to always return to doing some of that internal work of unlearning much of what has been taught by dominant culture. Right? And as a person, as I said, with a lot of dominant identities, a lot of privileged identities, there's a lot of unlearning to do. Right? So that sharp reminder was really important. Finally, we had the presentation of the State of the Field report by Russ and the wonderful panel responding to and reflecting on the state of the field led by Opta. Together, that group took on a wide range of questions for us to be thinking about. It was incredible following all of the questions and issues that you all addressed, but a lot of things for us to be thinking about in the current moment, such as how we can improve the breadth and depth of networking and mentoring in the field. One thing that really stuck with me from that discussion was the need to find innovative ways to engage men and boys while simultaneously centering marginalized peoples. And that question for me tied back into part of the theme of decolonizing, right? We can't decolonize while centering the colonizers, right? It just doesn't work that way. So Apta's last question, how do we decolonize our work and this field, is one that's going to stick with me for a long time because it isn't an easy one to answer. And the answer is likely going to look different for each of us in the different spaces that we occupy, the different roles that we hold. I know for me as a professor, when I think of decolonizing the spaces that I'm in, the very first thing that comes to my mind is, hot damn, I've got some work to do on my syllabi, right? But that thought obviously is going to look different. That process is going to look different for everybody based on the spaces that we're in and the roles that we fill in the field. Part of the process that I think is going to be crucial is what Robin D.G. Kelley calls freedom dreams, right? We have to imagine the world we want to create. And sometimes we have to get beyond simply focusing on what we want to change and take a moment to imagine the world that we want to create. We have to dare to have those dreams. That's something that I try to push home with my students at the end of the semester, which is where I'm at right now. So this concept of freedom dreams is fresh on my mind, and it seems especially prescient here as we're in many ways being challenged to imagine where we would like our field to be, right? We have to do that dreaming. How do you get from point A to point B if you can't imagine point B? Right. So I'm leaving today with a lot to reflect on and a lot to be grateful for. As part of the gratitude, I want to thank everyone who has engaged today as presenters, panelists, attendees, our wonderful host. Please watch the NAMEN website for upcoming program announcements. There's going to be a lot there, especially debriefs and aftermath of the symposium. NAMEN is really proud to offer our attendees today a free one-year membership, and you should be receiving in your email the information about how to join and how to access that. So again, that's sort of my wrap up for the day. I hope it was helpful. And back to you, Karen.
Awesome. I think I heard you say the word hot damn. That was my favorite part. And then also, I was thinking when you said, you being a white privileged man, I was like, oh, but I don't know, like you have so much more to unlearn than me. So I don't know, you said I have so much to unlearn. So I don't know what's worse, which one's harder. But I loved when you said that part, that you have so much to unlearn, like that transparency piece that you brought to it, saying, yeah, there's a lot that I have to unlearn. And, but everything you bring to the table with your students, you're so dedicated to your students. I remember all the conversations we had, Cliff, about how dedicated you are to sharing your wisdom with the students. Unlearning is learning. Unlearning is learning. And so that's one of my favorite things to do, is unlearning with you. I too have some unlearning to do as a Black woman. Sharing the space with you over the last couple weeks and learning from you has been so informative. Thank you for absolutely everything that you do for NAMEN and for all men, and the way you engage men and boys, Cliff. We really appreciate you. That being said, I just really want to give such a thank you to all the panelists over the 2 days. This is really a thank you for the entire symposium as a whole. It was and is and will continue to be such a great journey, these conversations coming together, everyone from day one, everyone from day two. And I really also want to thank the participants. Without participants, without you registering, this isn't possible. So thank you so much for putting aside these 2 days and making yourself available and open, and the sharing in the breakout rooms and coming off a video and sharing your thoughts and in the chat, and these thought-provoking questions. Without the participants, it would not have been possible. speaking of not being possible, it would not be possible without the tech team. Tech is really, really, really fast moving train with absolutely no brakes. And it just goes and goes and goes until it's told to stop. And so just a big thank you for all the moving parts that goes on in the background and helping create this safe space where we could all come together and share our thoughts and links and comments, and everyone just looks wonderful. So thank you so much to the tech team, Sassy Livy Productions. You guys are just, there's no words to describe the endless work that you put into this. So again, thank you for that. Thank you to the board members. Thank you for coming together and sharing your wisdom. Thank you to Craig, who has put so much time into this, all the members. I don't want to forget anyone. Stephen, just thank you. Just everyone. Yoni, I don't want to miss anyone. Thank you to absolutely all of you for having me as your host, for inviting me, for including me on this conversation. I'm honored to have done this, and I too have learned so much. As you guys may or may not know, I have a talk show, and at the end of the talk show, I always have an affirmation to leave us all with, and I certainly want to do that with us here again today to close out just on some closing thoughts that I hope will really bring together everything that we spoke about. I'm a firm believer that affirmations repeated daily, out loud and verbally, put great energy into the universe. Is really an Ubuntu moment. So if we could just bring that up, and I'll read it out for you guys, one that I thought would be a great fit. I hope you like what I've created for you. It says, I understand that the empowerment of others does not threaten my strength or masculinity as a man. I acknowledge gender oppression and strive to achieve gender equality. I continuously educate myself on intersectionality and decolonization. I support others to promote health for men, women, and children while engaging men and boys. And that is something I actually said this morning before opening it up, and it really just opened up my heart and my mind to the work that we all have to do. This is a collective effort, and I just want to thank absolutely everyone who has joined this symposium. There's lots more to come. Look out for your emails, and we want to just really, really, really wish that you all stay safe.